Hello, everybody. Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Adventures in History, where we're going to be doing a little bit of something different. First off, the biggest thing that's going to be different is that this is going to be really long. Um, After school special, all right. This is probably going to be easily twice as long, perhaps even getting close to three times as long. And it's also going to be dealing a lot with stuff that's going on like right now. So yeah, this is a little bit of a different issue, but um, you know, it's an interesting time that we live in. So yeah, this particular episode is clearly in light of the unfounded and unjustified invasion of the country of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin and the forces of Russia. This is a stream that is hopefully going to give you all some historical context for a lot of the stuff that's happening. The problem that we are watching unfold today as we turn on the news or look on the internet is not something that is a new problem. This is not something that has sort of formed in the last few months. This has a very, very long history, and it's very difficult to explain all of this stuff in detail without going back pretty far in history. And especially when we look at the particular claims that Putin has made about the Ukraine. For example, Putin has said that the Ukraine has never been a country, that they have no individual culture. He has also said that the Ukrainian language is something that has been made up and has no historical context. He's said other things like the Ukraine is being run by Nazis. All of these things are either outright lies or incredibly gross misconstructions of what is actually the truth. So I have sort of done a lot of work to get this particular episode put together in a way that you can have actual verifiable proof if you run into any of these particular arguments in the wild. And I hope that this will clarify a lot of the larger issues that people might be trying to grapple with as they're trying to learn what's going on through the media. I think we all know that the media is not necessarily the best place to go for a lot of historical sources. So, you know, there we go. So, to begin, when we talk about the Ukraine, it is important that we sort of zero in exactly where we're talking about. So, if we put on the borders here, the modern day country of Ukraine sits right here. In context, this is in what we would call Eastern Europe. The country of Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe. It has a population of about 44 million people. The predominant majority of people there are Catholic, specifically versions of Orthodox Catholic. The vast majority of them speak Ukrainian as a first language. There are people that do speak other languages, Romanian, Russian, and we'll talk about that as we go along and actually have some maps that I can show you that break this stuff down. So this is the Ukraine. The capital is Kiev, which sits right here. It's a very, very ancient city. Kharkiv is the second largest city. We'll be referring to Kiev quite a bit. This is the Crimean Peninsula, which is something that comes up quite a bit. So there we go. Now, of course, this larger country here is Russia, and it is the belligerent in this particular situation. So we'll be talking a lot about Russia. We'll also be talking about this region right here where modern day Belarus and Poland and Lithuania sit. These areas are all sort of tied together in this larger historical narrative. So where do we begin? If we're going to start talking about the Ukraine as an organized country, the most logical place for us to start is with a group of people that are called the Kievan Rus. And the Kievan Rus were an interesting group of people that have a lot of sort of interesting mixed background. So if we look at a map of their country, you can see it designated here in green. Again, here's larger Europe. The modern day Ukraine would sit sort of roughly right here. And you can see that this larger empire included most of what is modern day Ukraine, parts of what are today Russia, some of the Baltic territories, and part of what is Poland and Belarus, all the way up into what is modern day Finland. So this is a fairly large empire here. And if we're specifically looking at the Kievan Rus, one of the big questions that we have to ask ourselves is, who were these people, right? One of the things that Putin has been doing very recently is claiming that one of the reasons Ukraine doesn't deserve the right to exist is that it doesn't have a unique heritage of its own. And Putin, points back to the Kievan Rus and says, look, this is where the Ukraine got its beginning. This is also where Russia got its beginning. And there is some truth to that, because these particular people called the Rus are going to be inherently founding members of lots of different nationalities in this area. But who are they? Well, originally, most scholars are going to say that the Rus were Nordic in origin. So somewhere in the the region up here in the Baltic zone, perhaps where we would call today Vikings, but Vikings is sort of a loaded word. But there are several rivers that run south here into Europe, and as the Nordic expansion of the 700s and 800s begins, individual Nordic members, tribes begin to move up these rivers into the region that would go on to one day be the Kievan Rus. And that area was not empty. There were people there, specifically a group of people that are referred to as the Eastern Slavs. So you have a primarily Nordic group meeting a mixed Slavic group, and from the union of these two cultures, what you end up with is a group of people that called themselves the Varangians. And if you know anything about Byzantine history, the Varangians are going to be particularly important to Byzantine history. They're going to be bodyguards for the emperor. They're going to be in really big trade agreements with the Byzantine Empire. And that's going to be the basis of the foundation of their state. This region sits at very important crossroads of trade, specifically here from the northern Atlantic to things like the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, but also coming out of Asia and going into Europe and vice versa. So there are big north-south and east-west trade routes that run through this area, including the city of Kiev itself, which was originally kind of a trade hub. So the Varangians are going to be, again, a mix of Nordic and Slavic cultures, but there are going to be some disputes on that, specifically from people later on in time in modern day, especially people that are Slavic nationalists. So these are people that would have been in Russia and were sort of Russian national apologists, are going to deny that there was any Norse inside of the Rus at all, and that they were purely Slavic. That is not a defensible position. There were clearly elements of Nordic culture, most evident in things like their religious practices, some of the elements of their language, and some of their physical culture. There's going to be no doubt in scholars' minds today that the Rus people were a mix of Nordic and Slavic ethnicities. So anybody that is trying to put forward the idea that the Kievan Rus were a unified Slavic entity and that the Varangians were purely Slavic in history and never had any other background is misconstruing the truth, and they might also be lying with a purpose, which is, what we might call propaganda. So the particular situations that we're going to do right here are going to set up a kingdom. The Kievan Rus are going to have an organized kingdom that supposedly starts around the year 882 with a guy named Oleg. Oleg was a ruler of a city that is in modern-day Russia called Novgorod, and he apparently in 882 marched down to the city of Kiev, which had already been established by other people, and took it over and added it to his larger empire, and then made it the capital of his larger Kievan Rus kingdom. This is disputed. There is archaeological evidence to support a much later date of Kiev being included into the larger Kievan Rus group, and there is not particularly a strong amount of archaeological evidence that Oleg really did anything that has been attributed to him historically speaking. So it is fair to note that a lot of these sources that we are going to be referring to were not written down until substantially later. A lot of the people in this area did not even have a written language yet, so they weren't writing histories of themselves. Most of the histories that we have about this particular time period are written by people from outside of this area, especially members of the Catholic Church that went up to this region to try to begin Christianizing this area. Even the written language of Russia and a lot of the written alphabet of Slavic languages today, which is referred to as Cyrillic, refers to a particular church figure, Cyril, who was supposedly the guy that first brought Christianity from the Byzantine Empire up into this area. So there's a lot of external bias that is involved in some of these histories, and there's also a lot of potential for misunderstanding because the events that are being written down are substantially later in writing than they were in happening. So it's safe to say that eventually Kiev was brought into a larger group of cities that was dominated by a single ruler, particularly those individuals that refer to themselves as princes. There were different principalities. So there's a principality of Kiev, there's a principality of Moscow, principality of Novgorod, and these usually worked in conjunction to make money off of trade. The first of the Kievan Rus leaders to really begin Christianizing was a guy named Vladimir I, who in 988 apparently got baptized and then commanded everybody within the Kievan Rus world to also become baptized. This is going to tie them to an Eastern Orthodox tradition. However, when the Catholic Church splits, which is going to happen not too long after this, the East-West Schism, the church leaders inside of the Kievan Rus are going to stay on fairly good terms with the Roman Catholics. And part of this is because they are quite far out of the way, and they did not necessarily have an enormously large population that was going to cause a lot of turmoil when it came to deciding who got to, kind of run their churches. So there we go. Now, the Kievan Rus are going to continue to be fairly powerful for quite some time. By the end of the 11th century, which is from 1000 to 1100, they had become a very, very large empire indeed. But it's not too long after that they are going to begin to decline. One of the reasons they specifically begin to decline is because of, believe it or not, the Crusades. One of the big advantages that the Kievan Rus had was that they were Christians, one, and that they had trade routes that went into Asia. So during the Crusade period, what we actually see from Western Europeans and some Central Europeans is that they were going over to Asia directly themselves, which means that they were establishing their own trade routes directly instead of having to go through the Kievan Rus. Also, the decline of the Byzantine Empire at the hands of various Muslim forces was going to weaken the Kievan Rus because the Byzantines were their largest trade partner. So this is going to start putting a hurt on them. And by about the 1130s, so about 1130 or so, you're going to begin to see a marked decline in the influence of the Kievan Rus. And this is going to be especially exacerbated by the Fourth Crusade, which happens in 1204. This is the crusade where French and Venetian soldiers basically wreck the city of Constantinople, and to put a whole bunch of stuff inside the Byzantine Empire in disarray. There's actually a substantial portion of the Byzantine Empire that gets gobbled up by other European empires and sort of incorporated into a non-Eastern European viewpoint anymore. So there are going to be a whole bunch of moving pieces involved here, but what's happening right now is that the Kievan Rus are slowly starting to lose their connection with the outside world. And this is going to, of course, decrease the amount of luxury items and money and goods that are flowing through, which is one of the big things that the leaders of the Kievan Rus were using to keep their soldiers and their nobles in line. And there's also going to be external pressure, specifically here from a group of Mongolians called the Golden Horde. So the Golden Horde is the remnant of what used to be Genghis Khan's empire. It is at the time being led by one of his descendants, and the Golden Horde are going to move into this area around the year 1240, and they are going to utterly destroy what's left of the Kievan Rus, and they're going to conquer all of this territory. This is a substantially damaging situation here, because not only do they directly control all of this area, a lot of the area that was sort of part of the larger Kievan Rus territory here is going to be sort of put under suzerainty or vassalage. A lot of the people that were living in this area that used to be independent were going to be forced to pay yearly tribute to the Golden Horde specifically, and they might even be forced to allow the Golden Horde to choose their leaders. If you're on the border here, the bad guys can pretty easily just push you around. So you might have to change your leader if they say so. You're definitely going to have to pay them off, and they might even try to leverage your soldiers in the area in their own armies. Now, what's interesting in this particular zone, right around here, which is where, again, modern Ukraine is that this is going to begin affecting people in what is modern Ukraine differently than it's going to be affecting people that are here in Russia. So the Russian border would run roughly right through here. And Novgorod was right about here, and Moscow is right about here. Do people flee the area or just take it? Some of both. The Golden Horde was very, very scary. The biggest issue that is at play here is that the vast majority of people in this particular area were serfs. So they're tied to the land. They are agricultural peasants. They don't really have the opportunity to just run away. The nobles in the area are going to effectively bend the knee, because one of the things that the Mongols did when they took over was look for those people that are going to be locals that would be willing to basically fall in line. And the Mongols particularly liked leaving those people in charge, because just to be clear here, the Mongolian horde that came through was a fraction of the population, right? They're holding this area not necessarily by saturating the region with Mongolian or Tatar soldiers here. What they're doing is threatening everybody in line. And they'll ride the army through every couple of months just to make sure that you're straight and that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. And they're going to try to leave as many of the local people in power as possible in order to sort of make it a little bit easier for these people to tolerate domination. But there were some people that did flee, specifically over into this region right here. But the vast majority of people were not able to pick up and move when the invasion happened. But the ethnic mix here is going to begin changing, right? And this particular region is going to start seeing a lot more influence from Central Asian peoples that are moving through this area. The Mongolian horde, or the Golden Horde here, is also going to introduce Islam to the area. They had converted to Islam around the year 1000, so you're going to begin seeing a lot of different cultural mix down here that is not happening in this part of Russia. So this is important because this is going to begin delineating the actual difference here between people that are going to consider themselves Russians and people that are going to consider themselves Ukrainians, because there's going to be a large group of people that are going to begin moving through this area that are not ethnically the same as these people here. So you're going to have Khazars and Tatars, and you're going to have Mongols, and you're going to have a whole mix of Turkish people that come through. Lots of different individual ethnicities are going to begin living roughly together in this area, and this is going to have a substantial impact on the area overall. So in many cases, again, the local lords are going to be able to maintain their seats, but they're not necessarily going to be in control. And if we look at what happens over the course of about the next 80 or so years, the territory that is in Russia and what we would call today the Baltic states and Poland is going to start looking at ways to try to fight back against the Golden Horde. And one of the first groups that's going to be successful in doing so are the people from Lithuania. Now today, Lithuania is a fairly small country. If we put on our borders, where's my button? Borders. Lithuania is just here, sits beside Poland and Belarus. At the time, though, if we go back in history, Lithuania was substantially more powerful and controlled a much larger region. So by 1320 or so, the Lithuanians are going to decide that they want to start trying to take territory from the Horde, and specifically they're going to look at trying to reclaim these areas right here along the Black Sea coastline and the region right around here, which is where the city of Kiev is. There's another big city over here called Lvov, which is a fairly big city as well. So especially this region right here is really going to be targeted by the Lithuanians, and they're going to be fairly successful. They attack sort of out of nowhere, and they are able to take quite a bit of this area that is in modern Ukraine away from them. And this is going to introduce yet another new group of people. So here we have Baltic peoples that are going to begin coming into this area, and Polish people that are going to be coming into this area. So they're only going to be able to hold on to that area for about a couple of years before the Golden Horde figures out what's going on, and the Golden Horde retaliates almost immediately and takes all that area back. So Lithuania, when it moves in, is actually going to push out all of the local leftover rulers of the Varangian Kievan Rus. So for administrative purposes, these are Kievan Rus people that are being led by Lithuanian people who are in turn being underlords for the Mongols. So it's this sort of weird sandwich layering situation here, where the Mongolian Golden Horde claims the territory, the Lithuanians are administrating it, and the people that are on the ground are mostly the leftover Kievan Rus people. So it's very sort of hard to figure out exactly what's going on in a lot of these situations, because again, we don't necessarily have a whole ton of actual written documentation from this period. But by the time we get to 1362, the Lithuanians are going to become much more dedicated in holding on to this area, and they're going to move in and formally take over the whole zone and wrap it up into what's known as the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Is the specific, particularly area back then for reasons, fertile lands, crossroads, detour. Several of those regions cave. So there are quite a few really good regions of farmland, especially right here, sort of in this region, which is northwestern Ukraine. This grows a lot of food. It has a fairly mild climate with a long growing season and lots of sunlight. That's a good thing that you want to hold. There is a crossroad of trade that is absolutely going to be very important to this larger zone itself. Goods are going to move from Asia to Europe and likewise through there. Also from Northern Europe to Southern Europe and the Mediterranean through there. And yes, you mentioned a really important specific issue here is that if you don't want to deal with the Turkish forces, which around this time are beginning to organize under Osman Ghazi, who will go on to form the Ottoman Empire. If you don't want to deal directly with the Ottoman Empire, this is sort of your transit zone to get to Asia around them. So you want to hold this area for multiple reasons. So the Grand Duchy of Lithuania looks like this. So again, if we look at the map, here's modern day Lithuania. But this includes a lot of what is today, well, all of what is today Belarus, and a big portion of what is today Ukraine, and even some of what is today Russia. So the Lithuanians are going to be fairly successful in pushing back the Golden Horde. This is going to, again, be in a war that starts around 361, 362, and they're going to eventually begin to solidify their hold on this area, and for about the next roughly 200 years, the region of Ukraine, especially right here, is going to be under the larger dominion of Lithuania. Now, what does that mean for the people that are living in this particular zone? Well, again, this is going to bring a different mix of ethnic groups and goals in with them. They're going to again sort of be this crossroads of cultural region here, but they are beginning to establish a unique identity. So when we see people like Putin who says, oh, the Ukrainians don't have an independent identity, that is just flat false. The Ukrainian language is actually established well before this as an independent linguistic group. Under the control of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, we actually have some of the earliest written documents that are in the Ukrainian language. The specific dialect of it is referred to by linguistic scholars as Middle Ukrainian, which implies quite directly that there were older versions of the Ukrainian language. So even as far back as the 11 and 1200s, there's a unique Ukrainian language. So the concept that Ukraine doesn't have a culture and it doesn't have a language is flatly false, and Putin is just straight lying here. By the time we get to this sort of 1400s period of time, the Ukrainian people themselves are an identifiable group. Now, they are beginning, they're not necessarily something that has been uniquely independent for, the last 700 or 800 years, but they are an emerging ethnic group. They are an overlap group of a lot of different cultures. There is Turkish element within Ukrainian culture. There is Polish and Lithuanian. There is some Slavic culture left in Ukrainian culture, but it is an independent, identifiable, verifiable culture. So there is a unique Ukrainian identity, and it was already evident as far back as the 1300s, and it was clearly in existence even before then. The biggest hindrance that we have towards that is we don't have lots of good documentation, and they weren't allowed to be independent. Here's the thing. You can have an independent culture and not have independent rule. And I think everybody understands that, right? If you look at the United States today, there are lots of different cultures, but not every culture has its own country, right? You can have a nation, but not a state. There we go. So there is a big mix of people in this region, but there are identifiable Ukrainian people. So, yeah, the Kurdish people are an example who live not too far away from that. So, the union with, the domination of Lithuania lasts for quite some time, but there's going to be even a change after that, because the Lithuanians are going to be in a very strong position, whereas one of their neighbors, the Polish, are not going to be quite so strong. And let me update my notes here. In 1569, the Lithuanians are going to marry into the Polish royal family and effectively join the Kingdom of Poland to the Grand Duchy of Lithuania to create a new country that is referred to as Poland-Lithuania. So it was substantially larger and looks like this. Now, this is a pretty big state here. And if we look at our map, this is going to include a large portion of what is today Western Ukraine. Now, it doesn't have the Crimean Peninsula, it does have Kiev and Lvov, but it doesn't have Eastern Ukraine. Now, what happened there? Well, there were a group of Tatars. So Tatars are a specifically ethnic group of Turkish people that had begun to basically ally themselves with the Ottoman Empire in order for political and economic advancement. And there is a region right around here that becomes known as the Crimean Khanate, where a lot of Turkish people are effectively going to take over. Now, I should note, when we say Turkish people here, the Turkish people groups are significantly larger and more diverse than just the people that live in modern day Turkey, right? There were about a dozen different Turkish groups, including Avars and Khazars and the Ottomans who were from a specific group. There were Turks that were Muslim. There were Turks that were still what we would call today practicing a local shamanistic religion. There were lots of different Turkish groups. So when you hear the word Turkey today, specifically it's referring to the country of Turkey, but ethnically Turks were a substantially large group of people, even with different linguistic dialects. So there are several different linguistic dialects of Turkish that exist that go way, way back into history. So this particular region down here that falls into the Crimean Khanate and then under the control of the Tatars is going to be different than the group that controls down here in the Ottomans, but they're going to be similar culture and allied politically speaking. Now, what this is going to start doing, if we look at the map of where modern modern Ukraine is, this region over here is going to be attached to Poland and Lithuania. This region over here is not, and it's going to be attached to other groups like the Tatars. So there is already a division of people groups that is beginning to happen in this sort of larger region right here. And I mention that because this is going to be one of the biggest issues that we're going to deal with for the rest of the stream, is this concept that Western Ukraine is going to look this direction towards Europe potentially quite more, and this direction over here is going to look more towards the north, specifically to Russia. Right, so Azeri and Kazakh. These are different groups of people, different linguistic elements. Kazakhstan, by the way, is this large country right here. And we're actually not too particularly far away from talking about a group of people that are going to be related to the Kazakhs. But I did want to take a moment here to reinforce this idea that there is a growing difference between the population of this region of the Ukraine and this region of the Ukraine. And this is not something that happens 14 years ago, or even 18 years ago, or even 50 years ago. This is something that goes back centuries, and this is going to have long-lasting, significant impacts on the way that these two parts of the country are going to deal with each other. It's important to understand this. Now, when this region of Ukraine joins with, or gets brought into the union with Poland, it's going to bring a lot of wealth back to the region. Kiev is once again going to be a very popular trade city. Lvov is going to be a very important educational center. There's a big university there. There are a lot of people that we would consider sort of Renaissance elite people that are going to begin to move around in this area, whereas this region is not really experiencing that same level of cultural advancement. The region over here is going to be much more conservative when it comes to things like some of the new ideas that are going around through the Renaissance. And this is again going to have a big impact on the two halves of Ukraine. And it's not even really a half. This will become more evident when we get a little bit further in the discussion. So, one of the things that the Polish people specifically are going to be interested in the Ukraine for is this interesting culture that they have, that has developed around this time, that are going to be really good soldiers. Specifically here, a group of people called the Cossacks. Now, a Cossack, if you've heard that word before, you might immediately think of somebody that is a horse soldier, right? Not like a centaur, but a person who fights on horseback, right? And that word becomes used for cavalry. But originally, the Cossacks were a particular ethnic group that, well, a cultural group that is going to be hired on by many different empires as cavalry, right? Cavalry was very expensive. Taking care of horses was particularly, cost involved. If you're a person that fights on horseback, you don't have just one horse, right? You have lots of horses. What particular distinction made people laugh there? The difference between not a horseman. I'll try to throw a joke in every now and then just to keep everybody a little bit on their toes. And again, if you all have any questions, please do feel free to ask. I'm not dissuading questions. I'm just trying to make sure that I can get through this while I still have a voice. So, these Cossacks are going to be particularly sought after, and there are going to be large groups of people that all want Cossacks on their side. The Ottomans, who had built a substantial empire here, are going to want the Cossacks on their side. Of course, Poland, Lithuania here are going to want the Cossacks on their side, and the Russians, who had established themselves as a unified nation under Ivan the Terrible and were, in the Tsar phase at this point, they want the Cossacks as well. So everybody wants Cossacks on their side. And this means that they're going to start hiring these people quite a bit. So specifically here, this is going to be, there's not really any way to say this. Everybody wants to use the Cossacks. They don't want to treat them well. They just want to use them as tools. And this is going to begin part of the looking down the nose of people that live in this region from some of these other Northern European groups, especially the Russians and the Polish. So, there's going to be a lot of hiring of Cossacks, and to a certain extent, they're going to be even given fairly prominent roles in the military, but they're not really going to be given any social power. The Polish and Lithuanians are still very clearly in charge here. The Russians are still going to be very much in charge in their region, and the Ottomans are just going to flat not brook any particular questioning over their authority. So the Cossacks are dying for all these big empires. They're not really getting anything out of it. And that's going to be something that really starts wearing on the people of the region. And what's going to end up happening is that by the time we get to 1648, a particular guy named Bohdan is going to declare his territory and the Cossacks to be independent. And no, I don't want to be famous. I mean, I wouldn't mind being famous, but I don't need it. So, yeah, that was the front door. Shut the front door. So, specifically here, where's my notes? There we go. This is going to form what is referred to as the Cossack Hetmanate. All right, so this is the Cossack Hetmanate. This particular region declares itself independent. Bohdan is the head of a particular host of Cossacks. His particular host is called the Zaporizhian host. If you were paying attention to the recent discussions about the shelling of a nuclear power plant in Ukraine that happened at the end of last week, you'll know that that particular reactor was the Zaporizhia reactor. That's actually named for this particular group of Cossacks under Bohdan who declared themselves independent because this particular country right here is going to sort of be looked at as the first attempt of an independent Ukraine. Ukrainian is going to be the official language spoken. There are going to be multiple different treaties that the various countries enter into here. But basically, none of the big three countries in the region are pleased. The Ottomans do not like the Cossack Hetmanate being independent because this means that they are no longer subservient. The same is true for Poland, Lithuania, and for Russia. An independent group means that these people have, the right of sovereignty. These people have the ability to control what goes on in their territory, and you have to treat them at least as official states. So neither Poland nor Russia nor the Ottomans are going to officially recognize the Cossack Hetmanate as an independent country. But that doesn't mean that these people weren't acting under the assumption that they were an independent country, because they said that they were. And while I know that this is not necessarily the concept of I say that I'm an independent country so that makes me one, in this particular instance, this was culturally very important because these are Ukrainian people that are speaking Ukrainian, standing up for Ukrainian ideology, and they're not going to just let it happen. So this again is in 1648, and when it's clear that the Cossack Hetmanate is not just going to roll over, everybody then has to try to deal with this independent, right? Like, how are we going to approach this situation? So the Ottomans go, okay, so let's make some treaties, and we want you on our side. Poland, of course, is standing to lose the most territory here, as this entire region was part of Poland, and Poland was the most obvious aggressor that was about to come after these guys. So the Polish were big enemies of the Ottomans, so the Cossack Hetmanate said, look, here, we will work with you, and we will make an alliance with you as long as you help us against the Polish. And around this time, the Ottomans controlled a substantial amount of territory inside of Europe. They had effectively taken over the entire Balkan Peninsula. So Poland was right on the border with the Ottomans. And the Cossack Hetmanate here said, if you keep us or help us stay independent, we will help you against the Polish. Well, the Ottomans agree to that, but they don't actually honor that treaty. Specifically, the Tatars that are going to be another part of the alliance against the Polish are going to begin raiding down here in the southern part of the Cossack Hetmanate, And when the Ottomans are supposed to show up to assist the Cossack Hetmanate, very frequently they do not. So that alliance is basically bunk. So they're going to reach out to Russia. And this is a fateful moment because, again, Poland is, at the time, the most obvious aggressor against the Cossack Hetmanate. And they decide, well, we don't really like Russia as much, but if we can make a deal with the Russians to keep the Polish out, at least this will be something. So they make a treaty with Russia. And as another piece of evidence that we can use against Putin when he says that there's no such thing as the Ukrainian language, when the Russians met with the Cossack leaders, they had to have translators. And this is actually recorded in the histories that discuss this particular treaty that happened between them. They couldn't understand each other because they were speaking different languages. So next time you hear Putin say, hey, there's no such thing as the Ukrainian language, you go, there has been for hundreds of years. You're lying. So the deal here is we don't want Poland to come back and take us over. We would like for you to sort of be our big brother and help us out. And Russia goes, we will do that, but we're not recognizing you as an independent country. If you want to make a treaty with us, you're going to basically swear fealty to us. And you're going to become an autonomous region within the larger Russian Empire. And when this agreement is struck, Russia basically ignores it right off the bat and starts treating this like a non-autonomous region. Because even back then, they didn't consider these groups of people to be independent. It's part of Russia now. And this is a pretty fateful moment because this is the first time since the fall of the Kievan Rus that this particular area has been under Russian control, which was, again, hundreds of years in the past. So Russia is going to almost immediately start messing around with who the leaders are inside of the Cossack Hetmanate, and this was specifically done to weaken the ability of the area to govern itself. They're going to encourage usurpers to the thrones of the region, they're going to encourage rebellions within the region, and they're going to try to play politics inside of the Cossack Hetmanate in order to keep the area broken apart, right? They don't like the unified concept of a Ukrainian state, but if they can get these people to fight each other, they're more easily manipulated and they're more likely to do what Russia tells them to do so that they can try to get a leg up on the other groups of the region. Now, when this particular situation happens over the course of about the next 100 or so years, it becomes really clear to the Hetmanate that Russia is not really interested in treating them independently. They figure this out really fast. And some of the leaders actually go back to Poland and Lithuania and they say, look, we want back in with you, but here's the deal. If we join back up with you, will you treat us like a co-equal, right? Instead of being Poland-Lithuania, can it be like Poland-Cossack-Lithuania? Or Poland, Lithuania, Cossack, right? Can we make all of our? Can we make a triunate state instead of a bipartite state? And the Polish are like, well, we don't really like giving you equal status because we don't think that you are equal. And a lot of the people that were inside of the Cossack Hetmanate did not support this idea from the leadership because the Polish people were the ones that they tried to break away from in the first place, right? So conceptually here, this was not something that a lot of people thought was a good idea, right? The nobility wanted more independence because they were used to ruling by themselves, and they did not like the fact that Russia was messing around with that. But the average people still had a lot of axes to grind against the Polish Lithuanians because of the way that they were treated back when they were part of that larger empire. So basically they stay with Russia, and over time Russia is going to become more and more and more in charge. And by the time we get to the rule of Peter the Great in the early 1700s, Peter basically decides that the Ukrainian people don't need to exist. So he starts trying to Russify the region, and he's going to ban the Ukrainian language from being taught in schools. He's going to ban the publication of books in the Ukrainian language. He doesn't want art produced in the Ukrainian language, so no music or poetry or novels or plays or anything like that. And this is specifically to try to stamp out the independent identity of the Ukrainian people. And that is going to continue under Catherine the Great, who in 1764 brings the Cossack Hetmanate to its final end. Now, let's be clear, they had not really had a lot of autonomy since they signed the treaty with Russia, but Catherine is going to formally destroy the position that was the leading figure of the Hetmanate and fully absorb this whole region into Russia itself. So they basically don't have an option to be independent anymore unless they fight some sort of rebellion. And Catherine is actually going to go on to fight a really big war against the Polish and the Lithuanians, which brings even the last little bit of hope of potentially restoring some unity with the Polish and Lithuanians. So if we look at the map here, this is referred to as the Partition of Poland, and this is under the reign of Catherine the Great. So we can see here that all of this area is going to end up becoming Russian. This is after the state of Poland falls. There's a very large war between Russia and Austria and Prussia and the Polish, and we don't necessarily have time to go into all of that. But the country of Poland gets eaten up by three different groups. The Russians, who are here in the red colors, the Austrians, who are here in the green colors, and the Prussians, who are here in the blue. Now, specifically, if we zoom in, this part of the region over here is what is modern-day Western Ukraine, including the city right here, Lvov. And this part is sort of central Ukraine, and it goes to Russia. Now, Catherine continues to expand and basically brings this entire region under her control by 1796. So if we zoom in here, right, this is basically all of what is modern-day Ukraine, except for this little region right over here. So the sort of last little bit along the edge here was still under the control of Austria. So Catherine the Great is referred to as Catherine the Great because, well, she was a particularly powerful ruler that brought a whole bunch of territory under the control of Russia at the time. So this is basically the way that the Ukraine is going to stay for quite some time. By 1764, again, they're completely under the control of the Russians. Russia's not going to hold on to all of that. The Russia that's under Catherine the Great is very, very powerful. The Russia under subsequent Russian leaders is not going to be as powerful, especially when the particular region right here, which is the Austrian Empire, which goes on to be the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The region of Austria-Hungary right here is going to be a big sort of mortal enemy of the Russians, right? This is the Habsburg family. If you're familiar with any of the politics that happened in the 1800s and early 1900s, or even as far back as the 1400s, you know who the Habsburgs are. But the Austro-Hungarians are going to be interested in taking all of this territory. The Russians are not going to be interested in giving it up, but they're going to fight lots of wars in this region, and they're going to end up losing some of the territory to other groups, specifically the Austrians here. Now, again, this is going to start developing a difference because, once again, this part of Ukraine over here, which had already been in Poland, whereas this part had not, is now going to be taken over by the Austro-Hungarians. So again, this western part of Ukraine is going to be looking more towards Europe for its political ideology. Whereas this part is going to stay in Russia and be very much under Russian domination. So again, we see this difference here between what's going on in West Ukraine and East Ukraine. And again, this is stuff that happened hundreds of years ago, right? So over the course of the late 1700s and the early 1800s, there is yet more distinction being made here between especially these regions right around here and these regions right around here. So it's getting much more evident that there are sort of zones of influence here. Now, the issue here that is becoming fairly evident, if we look at the larger global politics of the late 1700s and early 1800s, one of the things that is going to become very, very big in this region of time is the concept of nationalism. So if you know anything about the development of ideology during the Enlightenment, the concept of nationalism is something that grows out of that. This idea that I have a culture of my own, I have a language of my own, therefore I should have a state of my own, right? So this is the concept of the nation state that gets developed by people like Hegel and thrown around a lot, philosophically speaking. And the Ukrainian people are coming to this ideology of, are we a Ukrainian people, right? Is there one Ukrainian people? And the answer seems to be, yeah, there is. There is an identifiable Ukrainian people, but how do we get to the point of ruling ourselves? How do we get national self-determination? How do we get to the way that we need to be, politically speaking, and maybe even militarily speaking, so that we can assert a new Ukrainian state, so that the Ukrainian people can have a home for themselves? And the answer is it's very difficult for them to do that. The Ukrainian people were divided at this point between three different empires, the Austrian Empire, the Russians, and the Ottomans, and no side was really interested in listening to this concept of Ukrainian independence. But over time, as the Austrian Empire has to flex a little bit to keep up with things, even so far as becoming the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the dual monarchy, they're going to recognize that their Ukrainian population is significant and deserves a bit of autonomy. And by 1848, the Austrians, the Habsburg family running the Austro-Hungarian Empire, are going to make an autonomous region for the Ukrainian people. And they're going to have a limited amount of self-rule. They're going to be able to run local politics. They're going to have some level of local judiciary, and they're going to be able to use their language in schools. So this is an important distinction in time here, because this is the first time since the ending of the Hetmanate that you had even semi-autonomous status for Ukrainian people. And what this does, because of the location of this particular state, which is again sort of here in western Ukraine, there are people that are living under the Russian domination that know that this is happening. And you start seeing people try to move out of this area towards this area to live in a more Ukrainian state. And what this is going to do is start making even a bigger distinction, because if you live in the eastern part of Ukraine and you're comfortable with Russian rule, you're going to stay here. But if you want to be more independent, you're going to move out west. And this is beginning to sort of like pour the people of the Ukraine through a sieve, and it's going to start separating ideologies. It's going to start separating the people that are going to be the primary users of the Ukrainian language from people that are going to be day-to-day functionally bilingual, people that are using Ukrainian and Russian, and the people that are living in this area that just fully identify as Russian, right? So there's going to begin yet more separating of peoples during this period of time. But by the mid and late 1800s, there is going to be a distinct and significant rise in something called Ukrainophilia, which is Ukrainian nationalism. But if you look it up, you're going to be able to find Ukrainophilia as a specific movement that starts in the late 1800s. And this is a nationalist movement. These are going to be people that are saying, we want an independent Ukrainian state, specifically want to be independent from Russia. They're going to promote teaching Ukrainian in schools, even though the Ukrainian language had been effectively banned under Peter the Great. And they're going to start making art in the Ukrainian language. They're going to start making plays and operas, and they're going to start creating poetry and writing novels and music. And they're going to use the Ukrainian language as a tool of protest. They're going to say, we are an independent group. We don't want you running our world. We want to be independent. And this is not going to go over very well inside Russia, because at the time, Russia was facing a whole bunch of internal and external pressures. They were falling behind in the empire game. They were not modernizing as fast as the rest of the countries in Europe. And they couldn't really afford to lose the food supply from the Ukraine and their population when it came to stuff like, workers in factories. So they were not keen on Ukrainophilia, and there were some movements to try to even put that down. But that's not really going to stop the Ukrainian people from asking for independence. And one of the things that's going to be kind of an interesting event is something that is called the January Uprising. This happens in 1863. There are some people that were living in the region. It was mostly under Prussia at the time, but living in cities like Warsaw and Lvov, that decided that they were going to rebel against their respective emperors and try to restore the kingdom of Poland-Lithuania, right? So we're going to bring Poland-Lithuania back. And there were a lot of people that were in the Ukrainophilia movement that supported this move. And they're going to say, look, man, if we can get Poland-Lithuania back, they will surely treat us better than the Russians, right? They'll just have to. If we can help put them back in control and create a territory that is Polish, Lithuania, again, kind of Ukraine tripartite state here, they will allow us to do what we need to do, whereas Russia won't. But Russia just crushes this uprising. It does not go over very well at all, and Russia comes back with a really, really heavy hand. And as a response to the January uprising, they're going to just outright ban the public use and even the study of the Ukrainian language in even in colleges. Like, you can't even use it as a basis of study if you want to go get a doctorate in something. You can't even study this as an area of historical importance. Like, you just can't interact with the Ukrainian language anymore. They're going to instead introduce a fairly heavy-handed policy called Pan-Slavism. And this is something that is going to be a kind of a thing that Putin is still echoing today. The czars of Russia are going to say, if you are Slavic, we should all stand together. So all Slavs should stand together. It doesn't matter who you are or where you are or what you're doing. We should all line up behind ourselves. We should make one big Slavic country. Now, it should be fair to note here that one of the things that the Russians were hoping to do was expand in the Balkan Peninsula. Specifically, they wanted to bring people like the Serbs, Croatians, who had some Slavic heritage, into their larger empire, because they wanted ports on the Mediterranean and on the Black Sea, because Russia was, of course, this big empire trying to expand. But this is going to fall particularly hard in the Ukraine, because they're going to say, you are Slavs, you have no individual identity, you have to line up behind us. Pretty much, right? You're Slavic, you're going to line up behind us. There's no difference between us and you. And the Ukrainian people are like, yeah, there's a substantial difference between us and you. We've had a different history, we have different culture, we have different language, we have different history, and you can't just say we're Slavic and that's the end of it. And one of the things that some of the people today are parroting are actual criticisms that came out of the Pan-Slavic movement against Ukrainians. They're going to say, you don't have a language that's your own. The Ukrainian language is some cobbled together thing that came out of this Ukrainophilia movement. You all just decided that you didn't want to be part of Russia anymore, so your academic people got together and fake made up a language that you're all claiming to be your historical language, and it doesn't even really exist. But it did exist, right? We've already talked about how this language existed at this point 500 years prior to Pan-Slavism being introduced in the Ukraine, right? There was a Ukrainian language. It wasn't something that they just invented. Now, what Ukrainophilia had managed to do was completely, well, not completely, but substantially revive the use of the Ukrainian language. Because under Peter the Great, again, it had been banned. You weren't supposed to print books in it. You weren't supposed to talk it in church or anything like that. So when people began to use the Ukrainian language again, the Ukrainian people were like, heck yeah, that's our language, because they were still using this to talk about stuff during the day. They just had to also know Russian because that was the language that they were being forced to be used. And it's also fair to note that in the semi-autonomous region under Austria, they were using Ukrainian as well, right, as a language that they used every day. So there's no way and there's no justification in this concept that came out of Pan-Slavism that Ukrainians, you're just Eastern Slavs. Your original language was Eastern Slavic. You're not really any different than anybody else. Just sign up and load up because this is what's happening to you. You don't have an identity because we won't let you have one. That is very, very accurate. That is exactly what the Pan-Slavist movement was trying to make happen inside of the Ukraine, because they strategically could not let this area go, and they did have a very negative opinion of anybody that wasn't really their people, right? So what happens here? So as these crackdowns really set in, this is going to further divide the Ukraine. And the people that are going to retain Ukrainophilia and the people that are going to try to hold on to Ukrainian culture are going to make concerted efforts to leave the Russian part and move over into the Austrian part. And the division that had begun under the early divisions when 1848 happens and we get a little bit of a corner of ourselves over here in Austria, that is going to be exacerbated by the fact that Russia is once again heavy-handed banning all of Ukrainian culture. So the people over here that were in the farthest parts of this region that had been more integrated into Russian are going to adopt the Russification. They're going to sort of buy into this Pan-Slavic idea. And this never really, I never really understood this, because the vast majority of the people that were over here aren't really Slavic in the same way that people in Russia are Slavic. These people, especially over here in the eastern part of the Ukraine, are much more of an ethnic mix with people from Central and Southern Asia than they necessarily are from people that are like from the old Moscow, Novgorod region. So it is what it is, though, and this region began to Russify quite a bit, whereas people left this region and the central region to come over here into the Austrian region so that they could continue practicing and speaking and doing their things with Ukrainian culture. Now, this is bringing us up to World War I, right? World War I is going to be pretty substantially important here, because at the end of the 1800s and the very beginning of the 1900s, it became very clear that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was not doing very well. And it had already made a dual monarchy where Hungary had been recognized as an independent kingdom inside of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's not the Austrian Empire anymore, it's Austro-Hungarian Empire. And if we look in history at the people that were running the show here, we have, of course, the famous Franz Ferdinand, who was assassinated to begin World War One, but even his father, Franz Joseph, they understood that there were ethnic divisions within their empire that were substantial independent cultures, right? This is the whole reason why they had given the Hungarians an independent monarchy as well. Now, Franz Joseph was the monarch of both. He was the king of Hungary and the emperor of Hungary, right? But, they had their own courts and they could teach stuff in their own language. And it's pretty clear from basically all of the material that we are basically able to look through, and this is a substantial amount of documentation, by the way, that Franz Ferdinand had a very different concept of how he wanted to run the Austro-Hungarian Empire than the way that his dad did. His dad was very, very kind of hardline. He was very do it my way or else, and it's fairly evident that Franz Ferdinand wanted something that looked a little bit more like a confederation of ethnic nations, where there would be one emperor, but there would be several different sort of autonomous states that all worked together in a confederation. Now, whether or not he was ever going to accomplish that is a question for a different stream, but specifically here, Franz Ferdinand pretty clearly thought that the Ukrainians would be one of these people groups. And there were a lot of murmurs inside of Russia with, holy crap, if the Austro-Hungarians give the Ukrainians an autonomous state, this is not going to go well for us, because there's going to be a rebellion inside of our Ukrainian territory. They're going to want to go join up with that autonomous state. This is going to be real, real bad. And for that reason and many others, Russia wasn't really upset when Franz Ferdinand got killed, because this was going to sort of end this potential threat of the Ukrainians being considered a potentially independent nation. And they quite liked that, right? Good, we don't have to worry about them. So, World War I sets up, and over the course of the war, the region that is modern-day Ukraine got just completely wrecked. It got invaded by Ottomans, it got invaded by French people, it got invaded by Austrians and Hungarians, it got used as a staging ground for the Russians. The infrastructure of the area was crippled. Lots of the train tracks that ran in the zone were just absolutely wrecked. They were the targets of bombardment with artillery pieces. There were humongous food shortages. And in an area that was particularly important for food production, they're basically going to be stripped clean of all of their food, right? When Russia is trying to support this humongous army in the war, they're going to take everything that they can put their hands on, right? And the Ukraine is not going to be able to hold on to its own territory, its own food, because it's going to be sent off to feed all of these people. Also, the population of the Ukraine is going to be pulled really, really heavily into the war. The estimates are really hard to put, but conservative estimates would say that up to maybe 30% of the Russian soldiers that died along the so-called Eastern Front of World War I for Russia were actually Ukrainians, because they're pulling really heavily from this, because the system of Russia to mobilize troops was just in utter disarray. So it's pretty bad here. And when Russia itself begins to have really big issues, especially with Tsar Nicholas II, there's going to be a pretty big moment, right? This is going to be this is going to be the window that they had sort of been hoping for. The recent invasion had difficulty moving heavy equipment due to the terrain, boggy and soft ground. Was this a problem in World War I as well? Yeah, and perhaps even more so, because the infrastructure that was inside of Ukraine was not even as well developed as it is today. And one of the big problems that the modern invasion has that Russia didn't plan for was the fact that the entire invasion. That's a whole other thing. I need to just. Russia relies on rail for moving their military around. They don't really know how to use trucks, and they've really screwed up a lot of their logistics when it comes to moving stuff around the Ukraine. Also, the Ukrainian people have figured out what Russian fuel trucks look like, and they're bombing them with things like Molotov cocktails to blow them up. And this is causing havoc for the Russian infantry because they don't know how to logistically move without gas. Now, with the longer that they hold on to the territory, the worse this is going to be for the Ukrainians, because the Russian military actually has specialist forces that can build temporary pipelines for things like gasoline and diesel fuel. So if Russia can get those extended into the Ukraine, it's going to be a lot worse than it is right now when they're having to move everything around by truck. But yeah, the region itself has quite a bit of soft ground and has a substantial amount of rainfall during the wet part of the year. So, World War I, it wrecks the Ukraine, but it also wrecks Russia. And in 1917, there is a revolution where Nicholas II is going to abdicate the throne of Russia. And as soon as that happens, the Ukrainian people within Russia are going to rebel. And they're going to declare themselves independent, and they're going to say that they are the Ukrainian people. They're going to make a new country. They're going to force out the Russian occupying troops. And what's interesting here is that a lot of the troops that were fighting for Russia on these borders with, World War I soldiers were, again, Ukrainians. So they're going to just sort of pivot and say, we're going to push you out now. And the Russian Central Authority being under shambles of, things like the Kerenskys and then later the early stuff with Lenin, they're not going to be able to hold up. There is no "the" in Ukraine. I'm not sure I'm following here. It's not I don't know. So they're going to declare themselves independent in 1918, and this is not going to last too terribly long, because one of the things that's going to happen is when Lenin gets control of the Russian army, specifically here the Red Army, one of the things that they're going to try to do is immediately turn around, go back down, and just invade Ukraine. And it's a mess, because the Red Army is very big, it's very skilled, and Lenin doesn't really have a problem killing people. So the Ukrainians are going to have to immediately fight a war of independence against the Russians. But what's interesting here is that the Russians and the Germans are going to end up signing a treaty. So Lenin signs a treaty with the Germans to end World War I on their front. And then the Ukrainians are going to sign a treaty with Germany, where Germany actually recognizes and secures the independence of Ukraine. So the Germans are going to come to the support of the Ukrainian people and say, yes, you actually are a country. And the territory that they claimed was this. So this is the original country of free Ukraine. And we can see here that it contains a big chunk of territory, including a whole bunch of land that was over here in Central Europe, including a whole bunch of land that was over here on this coastline of the Black Sea, Crimean Peninsula. It's a pretty big territory, right? So this is a pretty big country. Now, this doesn't get to last very long, unfortunately. Specifically, what ends up happening is that when World War I officially ends and the Germans are forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles, which cripples their military, this once again leaves the Ukrainians sort of out on the limb. They don't have another country that is going to stand up beside them and help them out. Also, the winners of the war the Allies, this is France and Italy and Britain and the United States, are not really going to listen to the Ukrainians as much as they listen to the Polish people. For whatever reason, the Ukrainian people are not going to be allowed the same sort of voice at the Paris Peace Conference. And, well, when the Germans move out, Lenin moves right back in. And he's going to nullify the treaty with Germany and say that, oh, no, the Ukrainian treaty was not legitimate, that this country was not legitimate, that this is all part of Russia still, that you were not an independent country for about 2 years. It lasts about 2 years. You are not an independent country. You did not have this power, blah, blah, blah. You're once again part of Russia. Now, this is going to be exacerbated by the fact that the Austro-Hungarian Empire is also going to collapse at the end of World War I. So now there's a whole bunch of questioning over what actually happens with this territory, right? What does this region do? Like, what do we do with it? Well, if you know anything about 1919 and the Paris Peace Conference, you'll know that one of the things that happened was the creation of a whole bunch of new countries and the reestablishment of other countries and the drawing of a whole lot of borders. Well, while the Paris Peace Conference is actually going on, the Polish people decide we're going to reestablish our country of Poland, and we're going to take back a lot of this territory that the Polish-Lithuanian people had way back in time. Right, so going all the way back to the period of time where we have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth here, and there's going to be a pretty bloody war because the Ukrainian forces and the Polish forces are going to be fighting over basically what was Western Ukraine at the time, including the city of Lvov, which we've mentioned a few times, and the Polish are going to end up getting the upper hand, and because of, again, whatever reason, the allies of the Treaty of Versailles are going to take the side of the Polish, and they're going to form the Second Polish Commonwealth. And this is going to be quite big, and it's going to be rather damaging to the Ukrainian population. Now, the Second Polish Commonwealth was supposed to have a autonomous region specifically for Ukrainians, right? There was supposed to be a whole enclave, an independent state that was governed by the Second Polish Commonwealth, where Ukrainians were able to practice their own language, have limited self-rule. So basically, they were trying to sort of recreate, the Allies were, this region that had existed within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the Ukrainian people had somewhat limited self-rule. Poland agrees to this and then doesn't do it. They just don't do it. The Polish had a rather negative opinion of the Ukrainians and did not consider their claims to be valid and just didn't give the Ukrainian people very much in the way of anything. So by 1919, a large portion of free Ukraine over here goes to Poland, and, well, Lenin takes the rest. And in 1919, Lenin is going to set up this guy, which is the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. So if you see here, this big thing right here is the new Polish Commonwealth. And this region right here especially had been part of the Free Ukrainian Republic, but it was given to Poland. And when Russia takes this area back over, it's also going to take away the Crimea and this region here along the Black Sea coastline and some of the territory up here in the north. So this region becomes a Soviet republic. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's part of the larger United Soviet Socialist Republics, but as we all really know, that means they're run by Russia. Now, Lenin initially hoped and promoted this concept called korenization. And there's a Russian word for this, but I have really poor pronunciation when it comes to Russian. But the idea behind korenization, this comes from a Russian term, but this was supposed to be grassroots communism being established in each individual region, right? So Lenin goes down to the people in Ukraine and says, look, here's what we're going to do. I want you all to have roles in your government, right? You're still going to be part of the larger USSR, but I want you to have a Ukrainian Communist Party. And I want you all to be able to elect Ukrainian officials. And I want you all to be as Ukrainian as you want to be. And he says, speak your language. Go for it. Speak Ukrainian, do your Ukrainian stuff. Also, teach it in school. Go for it. We want you to have an individual identity of Ukrainian concepts. This is korenization. And then what's going to happen over time is once we all the different parts of Russia, once all of our individual countries get to a point where we have good, strong ties with each other, then we'll start kind of standardizing and we'll start tearing down some of the walls. But for right now, you all go do your thing. You all be really cool Ukrainian people, speak your language, teach it in schools, do your stuff, put your people in the government. This is going to be great. And then Lenin dies. And we all know who takes over next. The guy that takes over next is Stalin. Stalin doesn't do korenization. When Stalin took over, he made it very, very clear that korenization was a Lenin thing and that he did not support it. So when Stalin takes over, he basically says, no, we are going to completely undo korenization. And his justification here is actually really, really important. Stalin says that what ends up happening under korenization is that minority groups in these countries that were Russians end up being mistreated. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds a lot like Putin's justification, right? Was the original Ukrainian different from the current Ukrainian language since it was prohibited for so long? So even Middle Ukrainian was not the original language. The original language was Old Ukrainian, which probably developed at some point in the late 800s or early 900s, originally speaking. But yeah, there are differences, but it's the same thing. Like there's a difference between Old English and Middle English and like what we might make fun of as proper British English and then like English that we speak today, right? It's the same language, but it's an evolution of things over time. Right, so, right, ye instead of thee, etc. So the Lesser Poland Voivodeship is where your family immigrated. Oh, wow. Nix, I did not know that. So that particular is this little guy right here, which is Belarus today, or part of Belarus today. So we don't get the promise of korenization. It's a false promise. For a little while under Lenin, it was really great, but by 1923, Stalin is just like, no, we're not doing that, because the regions of Ukraine that weren't Ukrainian, the regions that had minorities of Russians, were being mistreated. Like these people were just being conquered and beaten up, and he didn't like that. So no more korenization. We're going to go straight to Russification. Everybody is going to be Russian. You're part of the Soviet Union. that basically means you're running by Russia and you're going to be Russian. And Stalin comes into Ukraine and deposes all of their local leaders. He purges basically the entire operating function of the upper levels of the Ukrainian Communist Party. And he really hates Ukraine. He just really hates them. He ends up sending some of like the lackey people that he can't necessarily kill down to Ukraine in order to sort of get them out of his hair. One of the people he ends up sending down to Ukraine is Nikita Khrushchev. So Nikita Khrushchev ends up getting appointed as a political official inside of Ukraine because Stalin hates Khrushchev and he hates Ukraine, and he's like, I might as well put them all in the same basket. And he sort of kind of uses Ukraine as this, it's not a gulag because it's not in Siberia, but it's like there. You just go do your thing, right? So this push that Stalin has of Russification turns out pretty badly because he has a whole bunch of issues that he runs into. And this is going to be pretty horrible stuff here. So one of the more kind of horrifying events that happens under this period of time between World War I and World War II is a particular event called the Holodomor. Between 1932 and 1934, Stalin is going to try to run through these processes of ramping up communism. These big overhauls and these collectivization movements and these attempts at turning Russia into an industrial power. And he takes a lot of this out on the Ukraine because his plans are not going very well, and they don't go very well. But he starts taking it out on the Ukraine. One of the things that he needs a lot of is, of course, food. And he starts basically sucking all of the food that he can out of Ukraine. And when it comes to what is happening here, this is... Okay, let me be careful here. Modern historians that are not falling into Russian propaganda all recognize that the Holodomor was a targeted attempt at wrecking the Ukrainian people. It's classified by many people as a genocide against the Ukrainian people, but the events that happened were effectively Stalin decided that he was not going to supply Ukraine with what it needed in order to provide food for itself and supply food for its people. And somewhere between 4 and 5 million people die because he just didn't like them. And this was a way to get back at them. I'm going to steal all of your food. I'm going to limit the amount of hardware that you get to grow more food. And I'm going to try to just punish you however I can. And this causes a massive famine inside of Ukraine and kills somewhere between 4 and 5 million people. And if you look at Russian apologists, they go, oh, no, that wasn't on purpose. It was just a bad policy. It's an unintended consequence of bad policy. That's hot garbage. Stalin did this. He did this to the Ukrainian people because he had a very low opinion of them. He did not like their independence. He did not like the fact that they were under colonization. The Ukrainian people had managed to make more progress than basically any other non-Slavic ethnic group within the USSR, right? There's a really good movie on this called Mr. Jones. I've never seen that. If you want to link that in the Discord, Gracchus, I'd be happy to maybe give that a view if I could. So the Holodomor is, yeah, he says it's an accident. The The later Russian apologists say that's an accident. Everybody knows what it is. It was on purpose. So what this is going to do is set up the pre-World War II situation. Now, it's important for us in this particular context to understand what is about to happen, because one of the claims that Putin has made recently about the Ukraine is that the Ukraine is run by Nazis, and they're just full of Nazis, and that they hate Jewish people, and that everybody in the Ukraine is a Nazi. This is false, and I'll explain more about that when we get there. But some of the historical evidence that Putin uses to justify this claim comes from World War II. So, if we remember what's going on prior to World War II, we have two big empires. We have the Russians on one side, and we have the Germans on the other side. And if we go back to our images, Poland is going to be something that sat between them. So this is Germany, and this is Russia, right? Poland sat right here. Germany, at one time when they were the Prussian Empire, controlled all of this northern territory and some of this down here. Russia had at one point controlled portions of this right here. And there were some Slavic people right here, specifically the Belarusians, that Russia claimed territory of. So Germany and Russia decide that we're going to split Poland basically right down the middle, and you're going to take your half, and we're going to take our half. So this is what kicks off World War II. Inside of Poland, there were lots of Ukrainian people, right? These are regions, especially in the southern part of the Second Polish Commonwealth, that were ethnically in the majority of their region, right? So the region was majority Ukrainian ethnically. They were just part of the Ukrainian Commonwealth. And Poland was supposed to have given them a substantial autonomous zone for themselves, which they did not do. So be very careful here when you hear what I'm about to say. When Germany invaded Poland, the Ukrainian people that lived in Poland very initially thought that this might be a good thing, because they thought, okay, so these Germans are going to come in and they're going to beat up the Polish. Maybe the Germans will give us our own autonomous zone, because we don't like the Polish people either, because this is maybe sort of like an enemy of my enemy is my friend thing going on here. Was the population left over from the Polish-Lithuanian Empire? Are you talking specifically about the Ukrainian population? Yeah, that and the part of that region that was part of the Cossack Hetmanate, and the larger part that had been from Poland-Lithuania, right? So Poland-Lithuania broke apart. The Cossack Hetmanate declared itself independent. Part of that region was once again under Polish control, and those Ukrainian people wanted independence. So they think, oh, Germany is going to be able to give us independence. So be careful when you listen to me here. Very early on, there were armed rebellions inside of Poland led by Ukrainian people to help out the Germans. Because initially on, the Ukrainians thought this was their way out. Now, that did not last very long. It became very clear when Germany invaded Poland and then decided that they were going to further invade Russia and basically took over, all of this, right? So during the war, Russia basically lost all of this territory to the Germans, including most of what is modern-day Ukraine. A lot of those people figured out real fast that the Germans had a very negative opinion, right? They figured out, oh crap, we can't trust the Germans, because the Germans were being run by Nazis. And the Nazis looked at the Ukrainian people as lesser ethnic groups. right? So there's a word for the Untermensch, the lower people, and the Nazis did not consider uh, the Ukrainians to be of worthy people stock. And the occupying armies and states that the Germans put over the Ukrainian people were like pretty bad. So the Ukrainians weren't on the very bottom rung of sort of European folk, but they were pretty low, according to the Germans. Let me be very clear, according to the Germans. So the initial support that Ukrainians had offered to Germans evaporated pretty quickly. And there was a Ukrainian insurgent army that basically tried to fight everybody. And they were trying, hopefully, to reestablish an independent Ukraine. So they were fighting Germans, they were fighting Polish people, they were fighting Russian people. And in this process, they committed pretty horrible atrocities, specifically against the Polish people. There were several instances where thousands of Polish people, these would have been civilians, were rounded up and killed. And the Ukrainian people that were in this insurgent army said that this was in retaliation for not allowing them self-determination, that if the Ukrainian people had to take it by force that they would, and they committed war crimes, right? So this is a nasty scenario here where there's a whole bunch of wrong to be passed around. And I'm not trying to say that, you know, people like Nazis aren't bad. Nazis are clearly bad. Nazis are horrible. You should not be a Nazi. There's a lot of stuff that happened in World War II that is really unfortunate, that caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people, and lots of people had blood all over their hands for this particular situation. Now, the Russians are going to come out of "you should not be a Nazi" advice still accurate to this day. Can confirm. Don't be a Nazi. Nazis are bad. So, at the end of World War II, Poland is going to be substantially reduced in size. Germany is going to be substantially reduced in size. And we're going to get a lot of new countries and a lot of new borders. And Russia is going to end up with a whole bunch of new territory. And this is going to be kind of bad. When Stalin wins World War II, he's going to take this basically as a sign that he can kind of do whatever he wants. And this is pretty unfortunate. Ukraine itself had been really ravaged by World War II. They had lost about 7 million people as soldiers in the Russian army. They had lost thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the resistance to the Germans and the Russians and the Polish people. About 1.5 million Ukrainian Jews were killed in the Holocaust. And the big cities like Lvov and Kiev and Kharkov were all really substantially damaged. Kiev was almost completely flattened. Kharkov was like 70% destroyed. Lvov was somewhere like 60% destroyed. It's pretty crazy amounts of stuff. It's really, really heavy damage that they took. And this is going to depopulate them. And let's not forget that the 7 million people that they lost in World War II as soldiers is on top of the 4 or 5 million people that they lost just before World War I in the Holodomor, and the population had not even recovered from that. So they're in a bad spot. And because of the bad spot that they are in, this is going to allow Stalin to sort of swoop in and do really whatever he wants to with Ukraine. And specifically here, he's going to start using them as a pawn in his larger global power game. And the Ukrainians are going to be allowed into the United Nations basically because Stalin starts pitching a fit. So technically, Ukraine could not be in the United Nations because it couldn't make any international treaties. So Stalin pushed through changes to the Ukrainian constitution that would effectively allow them to join stuff if he said so. And then he convinced the other allies, like, America and England and France, that he had to be able to bring in some of his countries, otherwise the UN would be very unbalanced. So the Ukrainian seat got created purely so that Stalin would get another vote in the UN, so that there would be more of a balance, as if the Ukrainians were going to be allowed to speak for themselves and not do whatever Stalin told them to do, because he was running the show here. Now, it is fair to note that when Stalin comes back to Ukraine after World War II, he recognizes that he has to rebuild it, because the infrastructure that was producing all of the food and all of the manpower that he needed had been utterly wrecked and flattened. So there is going to be a lot of Russian investment in Ukraine after World War II, but let me be clear here. He's not doing this out of the benevolence of his heart, and he's absolutely not doing this because he has some special love for the Ukrainian people. He's doing this because he needs them to work for him. He needs them to go make food. He needs them to work in his factories. He needs them to repopulate so that they can put more soldiers back in his military. He needs them to hold his nuclear weapons for him. And a substantial amount of the Russian arsenal gets placed down here in Ukraine as soon as Russia starts building and developing nuclear missiles. And part of this is because, well, just to be honest, America is putting nuclear missiles over here in Turkey. And the idea of having missile stuff within striking distance of your enemies is a pretty big deal, and Ukraine offered some tactical advantages against other countries, especially down here in Southern Europe, especially countries that joined NATO. Because after World War II, we get the creation of NATO. Now, what's up with NATO? NATO was created as a response to the expansion of the United Soviet Socialist Republics. This is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There were originally several countries that were on the Allied side of the war in World War II. So this is countries like England, France. The Allies are going to form an alliance against the expansion of Russia. Stalin hates this. Stalin really, really, really hated this. He completely, the concept of NATO was just utterly backwards to him, and he did not like the idea of NATO expanding, and yet it did. Countries like Albania ended up successfully breaking away from the USSR and joining up with NATO. It's pretty nasty. So he could not let these countries break away, and of course what that means is he just squeezes even tighter. Now, he does eventually die. And this happens in 1953, and we get the reign of a new guy named Nikita Khrushchev. So when Khrushchev takes over, he had a much different opinion of Ukraine than Stalin did. And Khrushchev himself had a fairly substantially different leadership strategy or style than Stalin did, to the point that he actually openly allowed people to criticize Stalin's policies. And this was an attempt at showing that he was going to be different than Stalin, that he was going to be a more amenable leader than Stalin was, and as a way to show what he considered to be his appreciation for the Ukrainian people, he's actually going to give them some territory. So if we look again here at the territory that Ukraine held, the the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, he is going to give them more territory. Specifically here, he's going to give them the Crimean Peninsula. And this happens in 1954. Anyway, yes, foreshadowing here. So Crimean Peninsula given to Ukraine. Now, the Crimean Peninsula was mostly not Ukrainian. It's only about 25% Ukrainian people. So most of those people there are going to speak Russian and not speak Ukrainian as their first language. So it was an interesting movement, or an interesting thing here, but the specific goal was hopefully to kind of reestablish some positive connection between Ukrainian people and the leading Russian groups and give them a little bit more importance, specifically here along the Black Sea coastline, because the Crimean Peninsula was home to some of the big port cities where the Black Sea fleet of the Russians got docked, specifically here a big city called Sevastopol. Right? Well, the situation here is going to be a little bit better for the Ukrainian people. They're going to be allowed to take back over their own communist party. So there is going to be a communist party that is mostly run by Ukrainian individuals. They're going to be able to elect more local Ukrainian people. And some of those people are actually going to get into higher positions within the larger Russian sphere. So some of the people are going to be able to get kind of high up in the larger communist ruling party, and it gets a little bit better. But Khrushchev doesn't stay around forever. In fact, Khrushchev was seen by many people as incredibly weak, and he got pushed out by a guy named Brezhnev. Now, Brezhnev was much more like Stalin, and even though he was an ethnic Ukrainian, he was not big on sort of pushing Ukrainian nationality. In fact, when he took over the USSR, he's going to go back and start pushing Russification again, which seems kind of odd from somebody that, was ethnically Ukrainian. But that's what he decided to do. He was not fond of having independent identities within the larger USSR. One of the things that he wanted to do was establish a sort of pan-proletariat USSR where there weren't really individual ethnic groups. Everybody was just sort of more or less Russian, and everybody was sort of more or less unilaterally uniform across the board. I don't know how to say hello in Latvian, but hi. So this is going to be kind of a bad time for the Ukrainian people. However, Brezhnev understands the value of the region, tactically speaking, and one of the things that he is going to begin using Ukrainian territory for is pipelines. So if we look at the state of Ukraine, we can see that even today, it is a crossroads of trade, specifically here, gas. So this is natural gas, this is sometimes oil, but mostly coming from Russia and going to places in Europe or Asia. And if you'll notice here, this is a lot. And this is something that Brezhnev really sort of put on the priority list, was turning especially the big cities of Ukraine into pipeline hubs. Because of its geographic location, this was going to give him a lot of ability to get stuff into the rest of the USSR, because a lot of these countries like Belarus and Poland and These regions were part of the larger Soviet state. And this is going to be how he moves stuff around. And a lot of those pipelines are still there. And in fact, there are now more pipelines in the Ukraine than there were in the 80s when Brezhnev was running everything. So, what does that even mean? Well, this territory is economically vital for the Russian export of energy. And we'll come back to that a little bit later on in the stream. So, Brezhnev is, of course, not going to last forever either. There's going to be a few changes, a couple of sort of short-lived leaders of USSR, including Yuri Andropov, but we end up with a guy named Gorbachev. And he's very different. He was sort of the first big leader of Russia that was not part of the old guard. He had not fought in World War II, and he was an economist, very basically. Brezhnev had sort of seen a little bit of the writing on the wall, especially because Brezhnev drove Russia and the larger Soviet Union into economic ruin, and thought that this guy could help quite a bit. And when Gorbachev managed to get into power, this actually turns into something that changes the USSR pretty dramatically. Because one of the things that Gorbachev realized was the mode of economic production that they were using in the larger USSR was not going to work. So he starts introducing new policies. For example, he wants to allow people to write stuff in the press. He wants people to be able to interview Russian leaders and ask them questions. And specifically, he wants to become a little bit more transparent on how the Russian government is doing things. And he wants to reorganize some of the economic things that had been set up as far back under Stalin. So this is, of course, his policies of perestroika and glasnost. And while many people inside of the USSR saw these as welcome changes, the leadership of the Communist Party in Ukraine is not going to like these. They're going to look at these particular new policies as sort of like diet communism, right? This is not something that they're going to really get a lot of excitement out of. And they don't really like the fact that this is something that he is expecting them to be a part of. Because one of the things that Gorbachev wanted to do was give more independent power to the independent Soviet states. And while you might think, oh man, that sounds great, shouldn't the Ukrainians be really excited about that? The people that were running the Ukraine at the point were sort of still the old hardline people that were like, no, we liked this whole Russification thing. We were not really big on that. Now, these policies were much better received on the ground in many cases, but the leadership of the Communist Party in the Ukraine didn't really care for this very much. So when it looked like the Soviet Union was about to fall apart, the Russian party, the Communist Party of Ukraine decided to declare independence. And they declared themselves independent, and a few months later they held a referendum where everybody asked, or everybody in the country voted, and the turnout was incredibly high, and it was overwhelmingly for an independent Ukraine. And this is beginning the independent Ukraine. So this is in 1991, and they're going to begin having their first rounds of presidential elections. And the guy that they picked is this guy named Leonid Kravchuk. And his presidency is going to be important for several reasons. First off, it's the first one, right? So this is supposed to set the tone for uh, Ukrainian independence. Ideologically speaking, it did not go so great. His presidency was completely marred by corruption. Inflation of the Ukrainian money went up thousands of percents, right? You know, we think, hey, our inflation in America has been bad. It's gone up, like 15, 20% in the last year or so. In the span of his presidency from 91 to 94, it went up thousands of percent. So their money is basically next to nothing, and their economy almost completely collapsed. And this is not necessarily something that should be really surprising, right? Ukraine had been looped into a significantly larger economic network and had been in that larger network since 1919, right? So for decades, Ukraine had standardized trade. It had the backing of Russian monetary force behind it. It could always rely on moving people around if it needed to. It had the industrial backing that it needed to, and now it's going out by itself and it's having to make all of these new connections as an independent country, and that's just really hard to do. It's fair to note here that even countries like America, when we first became a country, an independent country, our economy hit the toilet and our money was worthless, and we had to basically rely on foreign friends to get us through. So this is not something that should be particularly surprising that the Ukraine did so poorly under its first president. Kravchuk tried his best to balance his approach. There were some people that called him way too friendly with the West. There were some people that said that he was still way too friendly with Russia. And he's going to do things that make both sides fairly happy or fairly upset. For one, Russia says, we want back all of our nuclear weapons. And this is something that had to be answered, right? Does Ukraine own nuclear weapons stationed in its country if they declare themselves independent from the Soviet Union? Russia said, no, give us our nukes back. And Kravchuk is kind of on the fence about this for a little bit. He does end up giving them most of the missiles back, but does retain a substantial portion of weaponized uranium and enriched nuclear material, and some of the sort of like the material needed to make nuclear weapons. But he does end up giving them that back. But Russia says, we also want all of our ships that were in the Black Sea, because remember, one of the things that was notable about the gift of the Crimean Peninsula was that a lot of Russian ships were stationed here on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. And these, Kravchuk says, no, I don't think, I think we're going to get to claim those. And this is going to be a really big bone of contention for quite some time. Now, what Kravchuk agrees to do is sort of a joint ownership of the fleet, where Russia can still sail around on the ships, but they're always going to sort of be in Ukrainian waters and dock at Ukrainian ports and manned by Ukrainian workers or Navy people. This is not something that the Russians are very happy about at all. Like, at all. They just don't care for this. But there's a big question. What does the Ukraine do when it comes to NATO? Does Kravchuk join NATO? Well, the answer is, in short, no. But there is a group of countries that were friendly with NATO, and they're called Partners for Peace. There's a program called Partnership for Peace, where countries that are not super excited about joining NATO can join the Partnership for Peace, or the Partners for Peace. And this basically says we don't have a problem with NATO existing, we just don't necessarily want to join ourselves. This also makes Russia quite angry because many states that join the Partners for Peace end up going on to join NATO overall, right? So this is kind of the sort of the first step of, are we going to end up joining NATO? Kravchuk says, no, we're not going to join NATO, but we are going to join the Partnership for Peace. And there is some early training stuff that's kind of done between some troops with the Ukraine and some troops from NATO countries. Specifically here, one of the things that Kravchuk does to really anger the Russians is come out and say, yeah, you all committed genocide against us with the Holodomor. You all, under Stalin, forcibly killed and purposefully killed millions of Ukrainian citizens. And of course, a lot of people just like get really upset about that. Why didn't Russia make its own NATO? It had the Warsaw Pact, which was a group of allied communist countries, but that fell apart with the end of the Soviet Union. So when it comes time for a new presidential election, Leonid Kravchuk is not going to get re-elected. Even though he had done some things that were good, overall his presidency was considered particularly a failure. He had a lot of charges of corruption against him. He hid a lot of stuff going on, and it was a pretty chaotic time. It should not really be surprising that he did not get reelected. The guy that does win is a guy named Leonid Kuchma. So Kuchma is going to be elected a couple of times. He's president from 94 to 2005. Kuchma is a very different leader. And we're going to start seeing here this sort of pendulum effect. If you'll remember earlier in the stream, there are regions of support inside Ukraine. The West tends to be more open to European stuff, and the East tends to be more allied with Russia. And if you look, if you look at voting results in these presidential elections, you can begin to start seeing divisions of, you know, which parts of the country are going to be pro-Russia and which parts of the country are going to be more open to European Union membership, NATO membership, etc. So Kuchma is going to be very much pro-Russia. And again, you start seeing this pendulum where you'll have a president in the Ukraine that is critical of Russia, and then a president that is very pro-Russia, and it kind of pendulums back and forth a little bit here. It doesn't always work that way, but with this particular changeover, it does. Kuchma gets elected with a lot of support from the southeastern portion. He does not get a lot of support from the West. And one of the things that he does in 1997 is give the Black Sea Fleet back to Russia. He says, you all can have this, and he allows them to lease out the naval base in the city of Sebastopol. So you, as Russians, can have the ships back. We sort of give up, claim a ship over them, and you can have this port, and you can use it however you want to. And he gives them a lease that lasts, you know, decades. Do whatever you want to, do your thing. This gets a lot of people happy, but of course it makes a lot of other people pretty angry. So Kuchma is also going to do some stuff that looks kind of pro-capitalism and a little bit less communism. He's going to privatize or oversee the privatization of a lot of businesses, stuff that the Ukrainian government had controlled under a communist state. He's going to allow private companies to start taking over some of this in the country, which is fairly decent because this begins to rebuild the economy. Again, under Kravchuk, the economy was in really, really bad shape. So this new plan where the state organ of Ukraine is going to release a lot of these things like railroads, manufacturing, oversight of things like roads and basic services like electricity and things like that. You know, the utility things that kind of make a state run had all been under the government under a communist rule, but Kuchma's going to let a lot of this stuff start kind of turning into privatized business, which is going to create jobs. It's going to allow money to flow around a little bit more. But it's also fair to say that a lot of the people that ended up with the control of these new private companies were supporters of Kuchma or his really close friends, right? So this is not just purely being done out of the goodness of his heart. He's getting benefit out of this too. Right, and this is of course why Czechoslovakia ends up breaking into halves. But that's a good point there, Broken. So this is also going to be a big deal when it comes to agriculture. Kuchma recognizes that Ukraine is still a very agricultural heavy country when it comes to production of goods, and he's going to make some strides in sort of rebuilding trade networks, especially to export food to other countries. This is going to begin bringing capital into Ukraine. So this is going to go a long way of establishing a more stable basis for their country. But there's a lot of stuff going on in the background, specifically with some of this scandal stuff. It's fair to say that no president of Ukraine, since they have been electing presidents, has had no scandals. All of them have done things that are considered scandalous. And the specific one with Kuchma is referred to as the cassette scandal. This is a really, really big one where some cassette tapes show up. And I know this is sort of dating the scandal, right? This is early 2000s. In the cassette scandal, it turns out that one of the deals that Kuchma had made in these trade organizations was to share some Russian technology with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And this is sort of going to overlap the whole mess with the United States invasion of Iraq. When the cassette scandal breaks, a lot of people should have been the mini disc scandal. A lot of people are going to get really, really upset because, you know, Saddam Hussein was supposedly this state sponsor of terrorism. There were all of these United Nations arms inspections. There were all of these claims about weapons of mass destruction. And now we have evidence of someone inside of the Ukraine that has access to Russian nuclear technology, that has shared this material with Saddam Hussein. This is a direct, piece of evidence that could suggest that, Iraq has actual weapons of mass destruction. And this is going to really, really hurt the relationship between his presidency and the West. So in an attempt to try to rebuild that relationship, Kuchma initially says, okay, well, I goofed up. Yeah, that was probably a wrong thing to do, but I want to join NATO. And as soon as he says that he wants to join NATO, man, Russia comes down on that real, real hard and says that if you want us to keep being your friend, you will not join NATO. So Kuchma's like, okay, well, I'm not going to join NATO. And, well, what's going to happen then? Well, how do you prove that you are still friendly with the United States? Well, the Ukrainian army is going to join what George Bush referred to as the coalition of the willing. Of course, these are the people, the various countries that supported the invasion of Iraq and the toppling of Saddam Hussein. So Kuchma is going to try to show that he still has some friendship with the West by attempting to perhaps right his perceived wrong of sharing this information with Saddam Hussein in the first place. But these sort of whipsaw decisions of I'm going to join NATO, but no, I'm not going to join NATO, but I am going to support NATO. All of these sort of back and forth things and the larger scandals themselves are going to mean that when Kuchma runs for, when it comes time to decide whether or not he's going to run for his third term, he decides not to run. So he had served 2 terms. Again, he's president from 1994 to 2005. But when it comes to election time, he is going to sort of pick a favorite here. Now, the 2004 election is full of a lot of emotion, and it has a lot of moving pieces here. So we're going to have 2 people. Their first names are both Victor, so I'm going to refer to them by their last name in an attempt to make sure that we know who these people are. We have one Victor who's Viktor Yushchenko, and we have another Victor who's Viktor Yanukovych. So these are the 2 sort of main candidates that are going to be running for president. So here's the way that the Ukrainian presidential elections work. They typically have lots of people running for president. Sometimes 18, 20 candidates. And for a candidate to win on the first ballot, they have to have at least 50.1%, right? So they have to have more than a majority. But very few presidential elections are going to win on the first ballot because of all of these different candidates, right? You have 18 people running. It's kind of hard for somebody to get, 50% right off the bat. So after the first ballot, they take the sort of top 2 candidates and then they go head to head in what is a second round of voting. So you vote first round. If nobody gets 50% or 50 plus 1%, you go to second round where it's a head to head. So Yushchenko and Yanukovych are going to be the top 2. And they both won about 39% of the vote. Yushchenko won a little bit more in the first ballot than Yanukovych did. So the first vote goes down, and these 2 come out ahead. And Kuchma was pretty clearly for Yanukovych. So again, Kuchma is the sitting president. He wanted Yanukovych to win and supported him very openly in the ballot, in the run-up to the election. And what ends up happening is they have a second round of elections, and Yanukovych is going to win. But there were a lot of irregularities. Specifically, there were exit polls that were being done, and the exit polls, so an exit poll is you go to vote and you walk out the door and somebody's like, hey, who did you vote for? And you say, I voted for so-and-so. The exit polls showed pretty strong evidence that Yushchenko had actually won and that Yanukovych had not won. And so there was a big kind of outcry that the election had been rigged. And a lot of people pointed directly at Kuchma, and they're like, this is you. You had control of the mechanism. You and your cronies rigged this so that Yanukovych would win. Clearly, Yushchenko was supposed to win. Well, they did not have an overwhelming amount of evidence immediately. So what ends up happening is that Kuchma sort of just shuffles really, really quickly and says, no, Yanukovych wins. He's the president, and he gets Yanukovych installed as president. But this doesn't stop the protests, and there's lots of calls for looking at the election and assuming the position that the election was rigged. So Yushchenko is going to file a lawsuit claiming that this second ballot was rigged. And this is going to get up to what is equivalent to the Ukrainian Supreme Court. And the Ukrainian Supreme Court orders a big investigation. And they turn up a whole bunch of stuff like ballot stuffing, voter intimidation. They found a substantial amount of evidence to suggest that voters had actually, or what they said was, we found massive voter irregularities. We cannot be assured that this particular vote came out the way that it did. So the High Court nullified the second ballot. And they said, we need to vote on that second ballot again. So now they're having another vote. And of course, one side, the Yushchenko side, is very, very excited about this. And the Yanukovych side, and specifically Russia, are really, really ticked off about this. And there's all these accusations of, oh, well, this is Russia playing a game, and they're forcing Kuchma to rig the election. And other people are like, oh, no, this is Europe pushing on the Supreme Court to find all of this stuff that doesn't actually exist. There's a whole bunch of finger pointing and name calling. But when the redo of the second vote goes through, Yushchenko wins pretty handily. And it's not even really a question. So Yanukovych gets kind of removed from the presidency, which he had held for just a little bit of time, and we end up with Viktor Yushchenko, who is going to be president from 2005 to 2010. Now, right off the bat, a lot of people do not like Yushchenko because they feel like the election was stolen. They thought Yanukovych won correctly in the first go-round, and they see Yushchenko as a puppet of especially the European Union and to a lesser extent the United States. So Yushchenko has a lot of opposition sort of right off the bat, and he has a really hard time trying to get anything done because of that. Now, if you'll remember me showing you this particular map here of all of these pipelines. Again, most of these pipelines are carrying natural gas. By the time we get to 2005, Russia had begun an organized effort to basically take over all of the European energy market. This is going to be how they were making lots of their money. And they needed those pipelines through the Ukraine to be stable, and they needed them to be reliable. Well, under Yushchenko, there's a pretty big scandal about these pipelines. By this point, 80% of the natural gas that Europe got from Russia was going through pipelines in the Ukraine, right? So 80% of the supply that Russia was selling was going through Ukraine, which is a country that is now being led by a person that is not necessarily cozy with Russia. This is pretty big because it starts showing up that there are some irregularities, to say the least, when it comes to the amount of natural gas that Russia says it is shipping and the amount of natural gas that countries in Europe are saying is showing up. And it turns out that under Yushchenko and potentially even under the previous administration of Kuchma, Ukraine had been skimming natural gas off of these pipelines to supply populations of people inside of Ukraine. Now, this gets investigated by some big European courts, and the Ukrainian government is charged with a really, really big bill to pay back all of this stuff that they had skimmed, and they basically don't pay it back. This is going to be a continual sort of ongoing saga for the next couple of years, because Russia gets very upset about this because they're losing money. The Europeans are very upset about this because they're losing access to the natural gas that they need. And everybody is upset at the Ukrainian government because they're skimming and not paying back their debts. So Yushchenko's got to do something to try to balance the scales here, and he decides he's going to apply to NATO. And he goes to the parliament of Ukraine, which is called the Rada, and he says, we're going to apply to NATO. And the parliament blocks it. And specifically, a group of people that he had thought were supporters of his were behind this particular block. And this is going to start making him get really upset at a lot of his political allies, including a lady named Yulia Tymoshenko. Tymoshenko is still a Ukrainian politician today, has run for president several times. She had been a fairly close ally of Yushchenko, but he's going to basically lose all of his good faith with her and her party supporters, and there's going to be a big party reshuffle inside of Ukraine. And Tymoshenko is going to form her own voting bloc, which sort of leaves Yushchenko even further out in the cold. So he can't get the application to NATO through the Rada, and he decides that he's just going to sort of go all in. And the lease for the port at Sevastopol was coming up due to be extended, and Yushchenko decides Russia can't use that anymore. And they pull their fleet into the port at Sevastopol, and then Yushchenko basically forces all of the naval people to abandon the ships and kind of kicks them out of Ukraine. So the ships are sort of stuck in harbor, just floating there, and he won't let Russia back on them. And this is going to be a pretty bold move, to say the least. And Yushchenko is going to get some support out of this from the western part of the country, but this is going to be kind of like the last straw for anybody that thought that this guy was going to be friendly with Russia. So when it comes to the 2010 election, Yanukovych is going to come back and just utterly destroys Yushchenko in the vote. It's fair to note that even before the 2010 presidential election, opinion polls inside Ukraine showed that Yanukovych was more trusted than Yushchenko was by double digits. The Ukrainian people have lost basically all support for Yushchenko. His own supporters that had sort of made a coalition of people to get him elected in the first place have fallen apart, and he was not very popular at all. He came in 5th in the election, which is pretty low for a sitting president, right? It was just pretty bad for him. So, Yanukovych, he's going to be back in power, right? He had that short little period of time in 2004 where he was president, but this is going to be a full term. And there's going to be a lot of motion under Yanukovych's term, and this is going to be a pretty eventful sort of period of years. So much so that a lot of the problem or a lot of the social issues and a lot of the social unrest that are happening right now in the Ukraine go back to Viktor Yanukovych's term. Why did they get blocked from NATO? So Yushchenko introduced a bill to proceed with the NATO application, and the people inside of the Rada did not support it. So he didn't have a lot of support from the people that were pro-Russia to begin with. And because he had lost a lot of faith with his own supporters, he could not get a majority of the parliament to vote for the application to NATO. The position was just too tenuous to force through. I don't think that he even had maybe a third of support of the parliament overall to get the application going. Some people weren't going to vote for that just to kind of spite him, but a lot of people were not going to vote for it because they did not think that Ukraine should be in NATO. He had lost political support, basically. All right. Yeah. So he was blocked from his own country. Right. No. If he had applied to NATO, he would have been let in. But it was his own party his own parliament that voted down the application. The president can't do big things like that unilaterally. They have to have support from the parliament. So Yanukovych takes over as president. It's 2010. He is clearly going to be more of a Russian friend than Yushchenko was. He is going to let Russia back into the ships in the Black Sea. He is going to basically work out a deal with Russia where Russia is going to allow natural gas from its pipelines to be diverted into Ukraine as payment for Russians being able to use Sevastopol. So this is like Navy or gas for ships, right? This is the arrangement that gets sort of put through that kind of smooths out the leftover tension that existed between Ukraine and Russia over that whole gas skimming thing that popped up under Yushchenko. So he's also going to take a little bit of a further step. And this is where we're going to have to start looking specifically here at linguistics. So if I pull up this map, it might be a little bit hard to see here. So let me kind of zoom in a little bit. All right, so here we see Ukraine. And we've got a sort of a heat map. Russian as a native language is not predominant inside of Ukraine. So 75% is only in a couple of regions. Most are going to fall between 25 and 74. And you can see that this is, of course, the area that had traditionally been more allied with Russia. And the less that you see Russian as a native language is going to be over here, especially in this region that had traditionally, for the past several centuries, been more allied with European countries. So you can actually see here that there are almost kind of two big chunks of Ukraine when it comes to native languages. And this is going to be something that begins to come up, politically speaking, because the population, especially in the eastern part of Ukraine, is beginning to feel a little bit like they are kind of being left out. And Russia, especially at this time, being run by Putin at this point, is pushing Ukrainian leaders to recognize the Russian minorities in a lot of these areas a little bit more thoroughly. So one of the things that Yanukovych is going to do is forces through a law that allows individual states, they're called oblasts, but individual states within Ukraine to adopt Russian as an official language if they want to, right? So this is going to be designed at sort of using language as a political tool here. This is going to make a lot of the Russian areas feel more like they're involved in Ukraine, and it's going to make Russia, especially Putin, very, very excited, because there's a lot of politics that goes into the languages that you speak. So half the official documents will be in Russian? No, no, no. It would be, you would be able to add Russian as an official language. So you, in some of these regions, you would have uh, Ukrainian and Russian as the official languages. It would not be one or the other. It would be one Ukrainian or both Ukrainian and Russian. And this is seen as a direct nod to Russian power expanding inside of Ukraine. And this is also going to be the beginning of a crackdown that Yanukovych does on what he calls corruption, right? So again, all of the presidents of the Ukraine have been involved in corrupt actions one way or the other. Yanukovych is calling corruption under his regime basically pro-Western ideology. And he is going to put a whole bunch of people under investigation and put a lot of his political opponents in jail, including Yulia Tymoshenko, the lady that had been one of Yushchenko's biggest supporters in the parliament and someone that ran a fairly successful presidential campaign in the last go-round. She was very vocal and still is very vocal pro-West and anti-Russia, and he's going to put her in jail and charge her with corruption. So when it comes to his larger stance, he initially says, you know, Ukraine is kind of a European country, so maybe we do want to join the European Union. But around this time, especially after the sort of larger ripples of the financial crisis that started in 2008, 2009 hit the Ukraine, they're going to be in a really bad state economically. And Russia is going to use this to sort of leverage Yushchenko out of the EU. So basically, Ukraine needed a really big loan to make a whole bunch of payments and keep on track with things. And so they go to the International Monetary Fund and they go to the Eurobank and they get offers on a big loan. But Putin comes through with the same amount of money and says Russia will loan you the same amount of money, and then follows that up with a threat of, and if you don't take our money, here's what we're going to do to you, and it's going to hurt. So Yanukovych ends up saying, yes, I would like to join the EU. And then Russia's like, no, 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 you're going to take our money. You're not going to join the EU. And here's also what's going to happen if you don't take our money. And Yanukovych decides, okay, we're not going to join the EU and we're going to take Russia's money. And this sudden switch in we're going to join the EU and we're not going to look to Russia so much as anymore, and then switching to, oh yeah, totally, we're going to take Russian money, and also we're going to be more friendly with Russia and we're not going to join the EU. This causes a really big explosion of protest. And this is referred to as the Euromaidan protest. Okay, I spelled that wrong. So this is something that starts in 2013. And as a response to Yanukovych saying, I'm not going to join the EU, a lot of people, especially in Kiev, the capital, are going to start protesting. And they're going to say, we want to join the EU. And this is going to be something that spreads to other big cities, especially in the western parts of Ukraine, like Lvov. And it's going to catch on quite a bit. And after a month or so of protesting, they're not going away. And Yanukovych decides, well, I will make them go away. Okay, so Euromaidan protests. There's a whole bunch of protests. People say we want to join the EU. Yanukovych says no, and also he goes to Parliament and pushes through a whole bunch of anti-protest laws, which are going to basically shut down protests. They're specifically designed to make the Euromaidan protests illegal and authorize the use of police force against them. And when these laws get passed, this actually exacerbates the problem, because the people then go, oh, you don't want to listen to us, and you totally don't want to do anything that we tell you to do, and they didn't go away. And it actually got a lot more violent. Some of these protesters literally took up arms and started firing at police officers. Some of the protesters in cities in the West took over administrative buildings in cities. There were claims, or reports, not claims, there were actually reports of certain people that were in these buildings that had been taken over by protesters using sniper rifles against people that were either counter-protesting or trying to get them out of the buildings. It got really nasty, and a couple hundred people ended up getting killed. Lots more people ended up getting injured, and this was a pretty damaging moment in the protest, because it switched from being just we want to get in the EU to we want to get in the EU and Yanukovych has to go. And specifically, Yanukovych says, "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere." So it's just not going to happen. Except that it did, because in the middle of all of this, the protest got really bad, especially in Kiev, where Yanukovych was, because it was the seat of the government. And there was a really big riot that basically was designed at taking him out and killing him. And he decided that he was going to flee the country. His life was directly under threat. There had been people inside of some of the armed militias that were directly threatening his life and telling him, if we found you, we're going to kill you. So he ran to Russia. And as soon as he got to Russia, he gave this big speech about how this was not following the rule of law. There was actually a vote scheduled for the next year that, if they wanted him to go, they could wait until his term was up, that he was not going to resign. But the opposition factions inside of Ukraine weren't hearing any of that. And they let a whole bunch of the political prisoners out of jail. They let Timoshenko out of jail. They appointed an interim president. And the government, or the parliament, is actually going to oversee a transition of power, and they're basically going to impeach Yanukovych and kick him out. So in the middle of this is 2014, by the way, this is causing chaos inside of Ukraine. The government is under an interim president that was formerly in jail and an open antagonist to Yanukovych, and Putin is going to see this as a moment for movement. And this is when he is going to invade the Crimean Peninsula. So in 2014, as soon as they kick out Yanukovych, Putin is going to move into Crimea. And again, one of the biggest goals that he wanted was to hold this city right here of Sevastopol, where the Black Sea Fleet was docked. And he wanted to take this area back. And again, he considered this region not to be Ukrainian in the first place. And there is some validity to that. Again, when it was given to the Ukraine by Khrushchev, only about 25% of people in Crimean Peninsula were ethnically Ukrainian to begin with. Now, that had increased over time, but it still was not a majority of the people there. And so what he's going to do is he's going to move the soldiers into Crimea. He's going to secure the Black Sea ports that he wants. He's going to secure the pipeline sites that he wants. And then he's going to oversee what he calls an independence referendum. So there's going to be a vote, and all of the people of the Crimea are going to vote on whether or not they want to join Russia or stay part of Ukraine. And of course, we all know that the vote is going to be overwhelmingly pro-Russia. Now, would we really ever suspect it to be otherwise? No, of course not. But that does not mean that we should automatically assume that the majority of people there were pro-Ukrainian to begin with. That region had not had the same Ukrainian experience as somewhere over here in the West had. That region had not been associated with the Ukrainian territory as long as some of the other regions had. Was the vote rigged? I don't know. I don't know if we ever really will know what the actual vote was. But I can say that had it been allowed to go what I would consider without question, basically if Putin wasn't standing over there with his finger on the scale, I don't know if the Crimean people would have voted to stay with Ukraine or not. They were not overwhelmingly ethnically Ukrainian. They don't speak the Ukrainian language there as much. They typically speak more Russian than they do Ukrainian by a substantial margin. Putin was there. Putin was on top of it. And there's a lot of doubt about whether or not that vote came out actually that way. But Putin's not done. There are a couple of regions inside of the far eastern part of Ukraine. And we're going to go over here. So you've probably heard these words a lot lately. Luhansk and Donetsk. When we put these two together, this is referred to as the Donbas region, which is another word that you might have heard of quite a bit lately. Now, Russia is going to look at these regions as more traditionally Russian areas. And if we look back at our map of who speaks what, these areas do tend to speak Russian more, which means that they might be, or probably are, more ethnically Russian than the rest of the Ukraine. So what comes out of that? Well, Russia says you just need to join up with Russia. And he's going to encourage these areas to rebel. And they do. They're going to form the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. And these are going to be initially just kind of rebellion-based political groups that have some support within the local communities. And of course, we know that they go on to become much larger movements than they were at the time. However, we've got to figure out what's going on with the president of Ukraine, because Yanukovych is gone and we have to have a snap election. And the person that gets elected is a guy named Poroshenko. So that's a whole other part of it. So Russia, of course, is looking at this region and saying, you're ethnically Russian, therefore you should be part of Russia. Whether or not those people think they should be part of Russia is their decision to make, not Russia's decision to make. Fair to clarify that. So Poroshenko is going to win on the first ballot, which is something that had not happened for a long time inside of Ukraine. He gets a lot of support right off the bat, and he is going to be anti-Russia. Everybody that did not like Yanukovych is not immediately going to like Poroshenko. He's not going to have, like 90% support or 80% support, but he has a lot of support. And one of the things that he immediately has to deal with is what to do with those two regions of the Donbas, Donetsk and Luhansk. What do you do with those people? How are you going to handle that? So the Russians had clearly left behind war material in that area, The Russians had also pretty clearly infiltrated that area with special forces. So there were Russian troops in Donbass all the way back in 2014. And how do you deal with that? Well, it's not a situation that's easy to deal with. But Poroshenko decides that he's just going to lean into it. He's just going to say, fine, if we're going to have a war, we're going to have a war. And he decides to mobilize the Ukrainian army and go into the Donbass region to put these particular rebellions down. And when we look back at this particular map here, what we see is Luhansk and Donetsk, but this particular region right around here is basically, it's not necessarily a ceasefire line, but the rebellion had expanded to this whole region, and when the Ukrainian army moves in, they're going to push the rebels back basically into these little pockets in just these furthest southeast areas. Now, here's something else that's important. During this period of fighting in 2014 and into 2015, one of the things that Poroshenko is going to do is allow for a lot of those quasi-military militia groups that had been involved in the Euromaidan protests to sort of work in conjunction with the Ukrainian army. This is not going to get him a lot of happy fuzzy feelings in a lot of people's worlds, because a lot of those people were pretty horrible people. So we need to talk about something here that doesn't get talked about a lot, and it gets thrown around a whole bunch, and it's the basis of one of Putin's biggest claims. So one of the militia groups that had acted inside of the Euromaidan protests was a particular group called the Azov Regiment. This is a pretty small group, but it's worth me mentioning them because of who they are. The Azov Regiment is a group of fascists, and many of them, including people that have been in their leadership positions, are neo-Nazis. They are that's probably a bad term to use here. They are hyper-nationalists, and they think that the only thing that should be ruling in the Ukraine are Ukrainian people. They do not care for Russia at all, and they had been a big detractor against Yanukovych. So what does that really mean here? Well, Poroshenko needs troops. And when he said, if you have a militia and you want to go fight in the Donbass region, we can give you some support. Well, the Azov Regiment signed up for that. And they got sent to Donbass. And they did a lot of fighting against Russians. So, we have heard that one of the justifications for Putin's invasion of Ukraine is that he's going to get rid of all of the Nazis that are running the Ukraine. Now, the Azov Regiment is tiny. The Ukrainian army overall has over 200,000 people in it, and the conservative estimates of the number of people in the Azov unit are about 900 to 1,000. Some reports say that there are as many as 2,500 of them, but it's really hard to tell exactly how many people there are. I have seen the number 900 the most in my digging up all of this stuff. So let me restate this thing. Neo-Nazis and Nazis are horrible. You should not be a Nazi. If you are a Nazi, you should stop, because it's wrong and it's stupid. However, these particular units in the Azov Regiment did get sort of co-opted into what might be considered like the Ukrainian National Guard. So not the official Ukrainian military like army, but into the National Guard in 2015. And in that particular time, they changed a lot of their leadership, and they did try to make a move away from the just kind of overt super neo-Nazi stuff. That doesn't mean that everybody in the group is now not a neo-Nazi, there are almost certainly still neo-Nazis in the Azov Regiment. These particular people have also been accused of doing some pretty horrible things, like targeting civilians, like looting, like rape, which is all horrible stuff. And when people do horrible stuff, you should say that it's horrible stuff. The Azov Regiment has done some pretty horrible things. But to assume that because a single quasi-official military unit of fewer than 1,000 people is representative of the entire Ukrainian population is utterly false. And it's not logically provable, and it's not a justification for an entire invasion of a foreign country. This is less than 1% of the entire Ukrainian military. The reason that Putin particularly does not care for these individuals is that they were instrumental in pushing his special forces out of several locations inside of these regions, and they were particularly effective at pushing the rebels out of strategic locations. So even though they are not nice people, they do appear to be fairly good fighters. And I'm not trying to say that one justifies the other. I'm trying to say that Poroshenko at the time understood that these people were horrible and made the decision that he would rather have people willing to fight for Ukraine than no people to fight for Ukraine. And so he covered over a lot of the sins with, well, they're going to go fight for our country. Whether or not that was the right decision, I don't think I would have done that. Yes, and that's a good point as well. The Azov Regiment recruits globally, and of the number that they have, we don't actually know how many of them are Ukrainians to begin with. We know that there are about 40 people that are from Croatia, because the Croatian government basically passed a resolution to try to ban any of their citizens from going to fight in the Ukraine. We know that there are people from Brazil. There are people from the United States. People from Canada. There's a large Ukrainian population that came to Canada, and some of those people have gone over to fight with the Azov Regiment. The particular benefit of them being not actual Ukrainian military is that they'll take pretty much anybody. You don't necessarily have to fit kind of the typical bill of a soldier, and you don't really have to go through the same amount of training. If you just say, like, hi, I want to shoot people that are bad guys, they'll pretty much give you a gun and put you on the front line. And yes, a lot of the people that are coming from other regions around the world are coming from other neo-Nazi units. So there are bad people in the Azov Regiment, no doubt. They have done things that qualify as war crimes, no doubt. They are not representative of the entire Ukrainian military, nor are they representative of the entire Ukrainian people, nor are they representative of the entire government of the Ukraine. And to say that they are is a gross exaggeration of the truth, and it's not a justification for an invasion of a country. And I'm not trying to play whataboutism, but there are neo-Nazis basically everywhere. There are neo-Nazis in Russia. There are Russian people that have left Russia to fight in the Azov Regiment against Russia. So they're bad people, and Poroshenko put them on the front lines and said, you go kill the other people because I need every soldier that I can get. And Zelensky, the current president, is still using these people, even though they have tried to move away from the neo-Nazi stuff. Some of their insignias are still old Nazi symbology. Some of their uniform stuff still has Nazi symbology on it. There still are neo-Nazis in that group. No joke. There's no way to get around it. And I hope that everybody understands what I'm saying here. And I hope that I've made this sort of abundantly clear. So, leans into this fight and pushes the rebels back. And by the time you get to about 2014, the end of 2014, Russia was willing to come to the table to talk, because it turned out that the Ukrainians were pretty good at fighting, and Poroshenko's alliance of militia and military had been successful in pushing the rebels back. much more so than Putin ever thought. So this is going to lead us to a group of debates that are going to be called the Minsk Protocols. So Minsk, capital of Belarus, they're going to meet. They're going to have what are called tripartite talks, and the parties for the Minsk Accords or protocols are going to be Russia and Ukraine and the representatives of the separatist leaders. So the Luhansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic are both going to be able to send a representative, and they're all going to sit down and try to talk about how to handle ending the problem. The talks are going to result in a ceasefire that gets put in place at the very end of 2014, and it only lasts about 4 months before the fighting starts back up again. It gets particularly bad, and they push for another round of talks, which gets frequently referred to as Minsk II, where they go back and they sit down again, but this time, basically, instead of sending representatives, they're going to send like the leaders. As long as it's safe for work and it's not super propaganda, go for it. So for Minsk II, which takes place in February of 2015, Putin's going to show up, Poroshenko is going to show up, the leaders of the separatists are going to show up. Also, Francois Hollande, the leader of France at that time, and Angela Merkel, the leader of Germany, are going to show up. And they establish new ceasefire terms, and they're going to try to figure out how to end this. Cool. Just to let everybody know, the link that has been posted is not one that I have looked at, and I don't know if I can endorse that. There's a lot of people that are doing collection stuff. If you want to help the Ukrainian people, do what you can. But I'm not trying to say that this is a particularly bad link. I just don't know enough about it to endorse it. So click, do your serving, and do your thing, right? By 2015, they have a new set of agreements, and none of the sides are going to hold up the agreement. The Ukrainians aren't going to hold up their side of the agreement, the Russians aren't going to hold up their side of the agreement, and the separatists aren't going to hold up their side of the agreement. Russia, even in 2016, said that they didn't even sign the agreement in the first place, which they did. But Poroshenko is not going to be able to end the violence in Donbass, and it's going to continue through in the remaining years of his term. So he's again president from 2014 to 2019. So one of the things that he is going to do is try to join the EU. And he talks to the European Union, and joining the European Union is actually a fairly complicated procedure. And what he manages to work out with the European Union is a roadmap for membership, where the EU is going to do certain things and Ukraine is going to do certain things. And if both sides do all of these steps, it will lead to a point where Ukraine can petition EU for membership, and the EU will accept Ukraine. Signing up for this is a big step for Ukraine. This is almost unilaterally condemned by the Russians. The separatists don't like this very much at all. But Poroshenko is not going to take that lying down. And he also pushes through changes to the constitution of Ukraine to allow for future application to NATO. So one of the things that had happened under back around 2010 is that the Ukrainian constitution had been written in such a way that it could not apply to big multilateral alliances. And the specific wording here was designed exactly so that they could not join NATO, that it would basically be illegal it would be constitutionally illegal for any president to try to join NATO. But he's going to change that. So Poroshenko is going to undo that and open the door for future NATO membership. He's also going to take another big step, and this is one that a lot of people didn't really pay attention to, but has a really significant impact on the Ukrainian people. Poroshenko pushes for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to break away from the Russian Orthodox Church. And I know a lot of people go, well, what is that even significant whatsoever? Religion is a big deal for a lot of people. And especially in a lot of these people's lives, their religion is a central push and a central drive to get them to do things. And over the course of history, because the Ukrainian church was considered a part of the larger Russian Orthodox Church, Russians had been able to exert pressure on Ukrainian people through the church. And when Poroshenko organizes this breakaway, this is going to be symbolic victory for him, but it's also going to be a very real victory for the hearts and minds of a lot of people inside of Ukraine, because this is going to, and what this did allow them to do was be able to practice a faith that's outside of political, well, I mean, it's not completely outside of political influence, but it's less under the influence of a foreign population that doesn't particularly care for them very much. So that's a big deal. And one of the things that Poroshenko does right at the end of his term that makes a lot of people sort of angry is when he decides that he's going to start pushing for more usage of the Ukrainian language across Ukraine. And he starts putting in requirements for radio broadcasts and for television. So in any radio station or TV station in Ukraine, somewhere between like 60% of radio, or 80% of radio and 60% of TV, or other way around. More than half of all radio and television programs had to be in the native Ukrainian language everywhere, including the areas of Ukraine where the Ukrainian language was not the primary language of people. So this was seen as a direct affront to people that were living in majority Russian-speaking territories, and it was not received very well by Russia at all. So there's Poroshenko. Now, 2019 comes around, and they're going to have another election. And Poroshenko is going to run again. Yulia Tymoshenko is going to run again. And a new guy named Volodymyr Zelensky is going to run. And Zelensky was not really expected to win. He was laughed off by many people as a joke because he was literally a comedian. It's also fair to note that Zelensky went to law school and has a law degree, and only became a Canadian after law school because he just found it to be more interesting. So Zelensky had been in shows where he was playing the president of Ukraine and then ran as president of Ukraine, or ran for president, and he beat Poroshenko handily. It was not even close. And a lot of people have asked, like, well, it seemed like a lot of people had Poroshenko kind of high in the polls, and he had a lot of support from Western Ukraine, where people were more pro-EU and more pro-NATO. What's interesting about Zelensky is that he is from Eastern Russia, specifically from southeastern Russia, and he is functionally bilingual. Like most people in, well, not, I don't know if I could say most people, many people in the country of the Ukraine can speak Russian and Ukrainian, but when we talk about how frequently do you use this on a daily basis, there are regions of the country where you use Russian and Ukrainian on a daily basis. Not you just know Russian and you mostly speak Ukrainian, but you use both of them a lot because your culture is one where you're in a region that is mixed and you can communicate both ways and you're functional in both languages, right? Like I can speak a lot of Spanish, but I am not a functional linguist when it comes to Spanish, right? So Zelensky is. He comes from a region of southeastern Ukraine and had a lot of support from there, especially from young people over in that region. And Poroshenko had very little support from the East because this is where the primary people that speak Russian are, the people that got very upset with his election in the first place, the people that got very upset by the way that he was handling the Donbass area, the region that was very upset with him pushing Ukrainian radio and TV. So Zelensky gets elected, and this is bringing us very close. So this is in 2019. Zelensky is still president. So 2019 to current. So Zelensky right away decides that one of the things that he wants to do is get rid of corruption, right? Again, every president since the beginning of the Ukraine has been involved in some level of scandal and corruption. Zelensky among them. And we'll talk about some of the stuff that he did in just a second. But one of his initial pushes is to try to get rid of corruption, and he doesn't really have a lot of support inside of Parliament. So he called for parliamentary elections because he wanted his political party to be in the majority of the Parliament so that he could get stuff done, and called elections and gets more support, but is still unable to get some stuff done. For example, he was trying to get a whole bunch of stuff kind of retconned with being able to appoint people that were under previous administrations. There had been some laws passed in Ukraine where if you were a part of a certain administration, you could not be reelected to a position for a certain number of years, and he sort of hand waved some stuff to try to get some of those people back in his group. One of the things that he did manage to get pushed through that was kind of anti-corruption was that he managed to pass some laws that stripped the parliament members from prosecutorial immunity. So if they did something illegal and they got busted with it, they could actually get convicted, which they couldn't previously. So there's that. But that doesn't mean that he's paying attention to a lot of the people in his own world. There were some people that are in his immediate proximity that got busted for some corruption stuff, and he brushed it under the table, right? So he's not a perfect leader. And he's also not one that is universally liked. It's hard to remember Zelensky prior to about a few weeks ago, and I'm not trying to talk about him now. Pretty clearly, a lot of the stuff that he's doing right now is pretty brave stuff, stuff that I would be hard-pressed to replicate. But we're talking about 2019 and 2020, and he did not have a lot of support. His support was tanking pretty fast, actually, prior to the actual invasion. Because one of the things that he decided to do was actually try to resurrect the Minsk II protocols. One of the things that Ukraine was supposed to do under the Minsk protocols was give Donetsk and Luhansk more self-rule, allow them a little bit more autonomy in their ability to choose things like judges and languages spoken. And in 2019, he followed through with that promise. And a lot of people really heavily criticized him for that. And he's like, I'm following the agreement. Poroshenko made the Minsk agreements. You didn't lambaste him for it. I'm just trying to follow through with it. And it's fair to say, again, like he's from kind of the southeastern region, and he has an attempt to try to really solve the issues there. But what really starts ticking off Putin is when he decides that, when Zelensky decides that he's going to start making actual motion on things. For example, he starts progressing Ukraine down the EU membership roadmap that Poroshenko had laid out. And this is going to be something that Russia does not want. Russia does not want Ukraine in the EU. Russia wants Ukraine looking to Russia, not to Europe. So Zelensky has this roadmap that had been approved already, and he starts moving down that roadmap. Also, Zelensky reaches out to NATO and says, I want a roadmap on how to get Ukraine into NATO. And they start working on a roadmap. And this is when Putin just can't handle it anymore. And this roadmap into NATO happens in the middle part of 2020, right in the middle of right before the pandemic sort of hit its apex. It was already pretty bad that way, but like things were not as bad as they would get. But this does not go over very well for Putin. He does not care for this at all. By the time Zelensky got to 2021, he said openly that he was working on a plan to reintegrate Crimea because he said that the Russians had unfairly annexed Crimea, and that was part of Ukrainian territory. So he was going to work on a roadmap to take back Crimea, even if it meant using the military. And Russia was like, oh, heck no, you're not. And this is when Russia started bringing troops to the borders. And from the very end of 2021, which was just a few months ago, Russia began to move hundreds of thousands of troops along the borders here with Ukraine and through Belarus into the border of Ukraine up here. So, did the issues with the pandemic help Zelensky get as far as he did? The pandemic hurt Ukrainian economies pretty badly. I would not say that he benefited from trying to govern through a pandemic. If anything, he did not handle it as well as other countries did, and he lost favor from some voters because of his handling of the pandemic. Again, it's safe to say that if there had been an election, even December last year, if there had been a snap election, I don't know if Zelensky would have been reelected. He was not a universally popular leader. I've read a whole bunch of reports about why Zelensky was doing what he did and why Zelensky wasn't as popular as he is, and it always sort of comes back to the idea that much like in the United States, voters think that the president has magical powers and the president can just make stuff happen. And when the president can't just automatically make stuff happen, the voters hold them, accountable for that. Following through with campaign promises is a hard thing to do sometimes. So Zelensky did not have, and still does not have, universal support inside of Ukraine. So the mass of troops begins in the end of 2021. And this is when Putin starts demanding various things. For example, he demands that the Ukrainian people not be allowed into NATO. He demanded that NATO not allow any Eastern European country into NATO. He demanded that the regions of Donbass and Luhansk and Donetsk be allowed to have referendums on whether or not to join with Russia. And he starts calling the Ukrainian people a whole bunch of stuff. He said that they didn't have a culture, that they didn't have a history, that their language was made up. And he said that they're all Nazis. And then about 11 days ago, he invaded Ukraine. So this is, again, based on a whole bunch of really lazy propaganda. Putin told a lot of the people inside of Russia that he was hearing all these reports of the Ukrainian people persecuting the government persecuting the people. He told the Russian army that they would be greeted as liberators, that they would not be invading the entire country, that they would just be liberating Donbass and Luhansk, that they would not be, the bad guy here. And they're obviously the bad guy here. Putin does not want the country of the Ukraine to be in NATO. He does not want them to be in the EU. He wants them to continuously look to Russia because he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. And that's sort of his ultimate goal here. He also does not want to lose territory where his fleet is docked. He doesn't want to lose territory and lose influence in territory where all of his gas pipelines run through. And he just he doesn't like the idea of Ukraine becoming independent. So Putin has not been held to a high level of propaganda. He's basically the rap musician Shaggy on propaganda. It wasn't me. Yeah, I'm with you. All right, everybody. So that brings us up to modern day. There we go. All right, everybody. I don't even know if I'm going to do a raid. I think I might just go ahead and call it because I want to get out of this chair and I want to go lay down for a little bit. So thank you all. I hope that the information here has been of service, and I hope that this is going to give you all an opportunity to respond to things that you see in the news, and I hope that this allows you to push back against silliness that you see. And thanks everybody for hanging out. Hope you all have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy.